Deus Ex is a pair of words so powerful that in the mere second since I just said them, dozens of viewers have already popped open their Steam app to make sure the game is installed and ready to play. 25 years ago, I came home with Deus Ex's big box, foiled in shiny blue and silver, and embarked on one of the most exciting gaming experiences I've ever had. It's a science fiction cyberpunk masterpiece. You build your character like a pen and paper role-playing game, while making decisions that subtly shape the narrative. You uncover a massive, multi-layer global conspiracy, one gunfight, stealthy bypass, computer hack, and conversation at a time. But this video isn't about that original game, because, well, I've already done that. No, this video is about its second prequel, 2016's Deus Ex Mankind Divided, by an entirely different development team based in Montreal, Quebec. Intended to serve as the middle chapter of a trilogy of games starring former cop and world shaper Adam Jensen, his games try to explain the events of the Deus Ex universe that lead up to the original game. How did the people who held strong positions in 2054 find their way there? Well, the Jensen games explain that, uncovering where they were and what they were doing nearly 3 decades prior. Mankind Divided is so weird. It has all the hallmarks of the franchise. It's a sequel that carries on directly from Eidos Montreal's previous game, Human Revolution, and it does some work to bridge their series to the original games. But it also takes place entirely in a single city, the European capital of Prague, while the other games had a reputation for sending you around the world as you piece together a global scheme. It's a game that exists in a transitional period in gaming culture between standalone immersive sims with narrower foci and strong entangled narratives, and open-world action games that have immersive sim elements, which became a lot more fashionable to gamers. But most importantly, you play Mankind Divided for roughly 25 to 30 hours, and after a climactic battle, it just ends abruptly. It's done. Without even knowing it, you've just witnessed the end of the Deus Ex franchise and its narrative ambitions as we know it. Even the DLC is just a series of prequel and mid-game narrative inserts that don't try to answer the questions that Mankind Divided doesn't answer. 9 years after its proud, undoubtedly expensive debut, Mankind Divided is the last Deus Ex anything in existence. Almost. It's stunning that within 16 years, Deus Ex went from sophisticated surprise to completely dead, despite tens of millions of copies sold. It's left fans spinning in their basements, speculating endlessly about when the fate of Adam Jensen will be revealed, if ever, and what role he was supposed to play in shaping the events that caused Deus Ex to happen. Despite Eidos Montreal's attempts to close out the Jensen trilogy, now managed by the ever-sprawling Embracer Group in recent years, the series has remained dead silent for nearly a decade. And now that you've reinstalled the original game, you might suddenly have that craving for more and newer and more exciting, even if Montreal's outings maybe weren't your favorite. You may still have an urge to dive back in, recap what happened, revisit its loud proclamations about what a post-mechanical apartheid world looks like after the horrible disaster that caps the events of Human Revolution. And before we dive in, you may think, hey, I've watched all 26 of your Nth reviews, and you already reviewed this game just after it launched. It's your 7th review, for crying out loud. And you'd be right, but there's a reason why I'm revisiting it here and now, which I'll reveal later. So let's buckle in, equip our AUGs, and see how well this holds up as one of gaming's most baffling conclusions to a storied franchise. It may not be the first, but it is the Nth review, number 27, revisiting Deus Ex Mankind Divided, brought to you by my patrons at patreon.com/the Nth review. Sign up to become a free member today.
And what do you oversee exactly?
I oversee this club, obviously, as well as certain relationships, certain efforts that require a matriarch's touch, and the comings and goings of certain strangers who ask too many questions.
I'm flattered if that was a threat.
Be careful, Metal Man. You don't really belong here.
If you made it this far into this video, and clearly you have because you can hear me say these words, there's a small but non-trivial chance that you only know what Mankind Divided is because it popped up on sale on a digital storefront relatively recently. And if you're not familiar with the franchise or its timeline, you may be wondering if you can just dive in having not played any of the other games. More specifically, Human Revolution, the game that Mankind Divided is a direct sequel to. In my original review, I said, sure, there's a recap video of what happened in that game, so that should be all you need. But with the passage of time and having reviewed Human Revolution since then, the grains in my sandy brain have shifted in such a way that, no, you shouldn't start with Mankind Divided. You can, but you shouldn't. Let me explain why. First off, you should probably watch my review of Human Revolution because, without spoiling everything I say in there, it's a streamlined, action-oriented game that's designed to feel like a then modern action game or RPG to appeal to new audiences, unlike the original game, which was weird and janky even when it released. As a result, Human Revolution was able to sell well by reaching a whole new, wider audience, which justified this sequel. Longtime fans would have their nits to pick by surrendering their ownership of the franchise to casuals, but fanboys are kind of the worst anyway. Secondly, playing Human Revolution will allow you to appreciate the various improvements they made for Mankind Divided. This is augmented by the fact that the latter game is more open than any in the series, allowing you to use your abilities in new, more interesting ways. Thirdly, Human Revolution sets up all the characters, companies, and events that form the basis of this game. It helps you understand mankind's transition to augmentations and why they're important in this universe. It also explores why people across all classes and demographics would be opposed to them, which is important to understanding the drastic thematic swings of Mankind Divided. Even though Mankind Divided offers that 13-minute recap that pores over every single twist, turn, and minor character of its predecessor's story, it's a miserable way to digest all that info because Human Revolution's story is needlessly complicated. Understanding it firsthand will help you understand it so much easier. Understanding Human Revolution's story will also allow you to fully digest this game's ambitious goals around describing a mechanical apartheid, a heavy concept if you're coming into it straight out of the blue. While the original game's narrative employed every conspiracy theory and pop culture to that point, a very different time that was. The Eidos Montreal games crafted an original story that portrayed a world that was turning the key on transhumanism. You have humans, yes, but you have humans who want to do more with their bodies that biology doesn't allow for. Mechanical augmentations allow them to not just overcome a disability, but in certain cases, gain superpowers. Mankind's unification around the usefulness and hesitant social acceptance of augmentations becomes Eidos Montreal's titular Human Revolution. You experience this revolution through protagonist Adam Jensen. When augmented terrorists attack Seraph Industries, where he serves as chief of security, he becomes augmented without his consent, hence his famous line, "I never asked for this." Now a human tank, his mechanical capabilities allow him to jump higher, lift heavier things, and see through walls, among so many other powers you can grant him as a player. This is the part of the review where I spoil Human Revolution, even as I've advised that you play that game and then watch my review of that game, so hey, maybe pause here if you don't want that yet. Okay, here we go. It's the future, 2027. The Illuminati secretly ruled the world. Kinda. They really just have outsized influence over it. They don't like augmentations since it potentially gives normies outsized power over them. It's kind of like corporate shitlords being against labor unions. Anyway, one of those members is Hugh Darrow. He's the father of mechanical augmentations, but ironically, he resents the augmented because he has a genetic defect that prevents his body from becoming augmented. This stirs up the conspiracy center in his brain to believe that augmentations are going to bring about the end of mankind. And so by way of an update, Darrow is able to key the world's augmented people in such a way that he can flip a switch and suddenly they become psychotically violent and start murdering millions of people. This is called the Aug Incident. Fast forward to the far future of 2029. We're now in the world of Mankind Divided. As expected, the world didn't react well to the traumatic violence of the AUG incident. Augmented people were violently hunted down in the streets. Those who survived the societal blowback seemed to go in 3 directions. A third were able to successfully reintegrate into society, although they faced all of the hatred and prejudices that emerged from the AUG incident. Another third were left to suffer in the streets without neuropozyne, the medication that augmented individuals need on a regular basis so that their bodies don't reject their mechanical parts. In this game, neuropozyne isn't just temporary salvation in a bottle, it's a rare currency. It's highly valuable in the black market, so acquiring it is useful to buy things. You can also trade it with an info broker to get tips on a few apartments to pilfer that require some interesting environmental puzzles to reach. You can even trade neuropozyne with a few store owners for supplies and whatever else they have lying around. The worst part of this mechanically is that you can't give neuropozyne directly to people suffering on the street. That would be a really small and very cool way to set up long-term rewards as they respond to your act of kindness. But many more augmented people, that final third, are rejected from civilization entirely, cast aside to far-off ghettos and a mechanical apartheid. In Mankind Divided, you hear horror stories about Golem City outside of Prague, and then eventually visit it as part of your investigation, where you see the horrific conditions firsthand. It's the hardest the game goes on an emotional basis to sell you on how bad the world is for these augmented people. One tragic example was finding a pocket secretary next to a young, dead man that held a conversation between them and their mother back home. It outlined their terrible descent and desperation after they decided to augment themselves and wound up there, but also his family's accepting love. This game's attention to the despair of this post-AUG incident world also helpfully forecasts the downtrodden conditions you encounter in the original game. These games really are class warfare writ large. Within the world, support for the augmented has disappeared in other very physical ways. Limb clinics, which were prominently located in the various cities of human revolution to support the medical and technological needs of the augmented, have been wiped out, forcing that assistance underground and into back rooms. Throughout Prague, you see the clear attempts at segregation, whether it's in the benches that are branded for naturals only, anti-AUG signage and graffiti everywhere, but also storefronts and prickly owners who aren't interested in giving the time of day to augmented patrons. There's even a plaque in remembrance of the AUG incident. The subway is segregated, forcing the augmented into separate cars than those who have been unaltered by technology. You can still hop in the natural cars as an augmented character, and this gives you one of the game's most magical moments where a kid looks up at you with a bright curiosity that's rare in this game. Of course, you'll be stopped by the state police and asked for your papers afterward. The issues that so many augmented people face in a world that has turned on them is something this game clearly sheds light on, but since it rarely affects Jensen, it can feel like a hollow prayer. There's little you can do to directly aid the augmented, and Adam Jensen, whom we'll talk more about in a bit, is an able-bodied Superman who doesn't experience any of the physical or physiological issues of being augmented. He's truly a rare one-in-a-million individual. He walks around the confusing slums of Golem City with few issues, and he's got a nice 4th-story walk-up apartment back in Prague to sleep at. With all of the military-grade experimental superpowers that Jensen has, the most inconvenience he experiences is some irritating conversation with bigoted individuals and the unskippable holdups by state police. The mechanical apartheid has little measurable impact on the world's most actionable augmented agent, and thus little on the player. We don't really get to see the acidic bite of this universe's anti-AUG bigotry until you get into the DLC expansions, which sucks because the base game could have really used more of that terrible spice. There could have been more severe consequences for Jensen being augmented than being really freaking awesome at everything all the time. I love Mankind Divided. It's not perfect, but it had more than enough for me to reinstall and replay over and over. Multiple approaches through levels, playstyles which felt unique, varieties of lethal or non-lethal, useful skill upgrades. I loved all of it. I spent so much time exploring every possible route, looting every possible object, and just soaking up the world. Even the lore was worth finding and reading, trying to link it all together. The last act bogged down a little, but they did so well with the city areas I can overlook it. Simply a great game from start to finish to restart again. Patreon producer James Just a Bald Guy Wyatt. Prague. Prague is pretty cool. Longtime Deus Ex fans who come to this game last in release order were probably surprised, like I was, by this game's insistence on hunkering down in a single geographical location. Rather than globetrotting between city hubs and far-flung locations with different cultures, languages, and characters, you have one big hub to operate in. Well, a bigger Prague hub zone with a smaller one next to it, but I'll talk about that more later. This city is your base, quite literally. You can visit your apartment, drop into the office, shop for work equipment, and hit up people for quests. Hey, what are all these police doing? Prague is an ancient place, over a millennium old. Even though this is a fictionalized version of it, its layout and architecture reflect its medieval roots. In the sphere of video gaming, it evokes the vibes of Viktor Antonov and his loving tributes to Eastern European architecture and design that made Half-Life 2's City 17 or Dishonored's more stylized Dunwall pop to life. Prague's map is tight, angular, and extremely walkable. It has a layout, architecture, and features monuments to people, places, and events that give Mankind Divided a sense of place. It gives this game's Prague a truly humanistic vibe that comes the closest in the series to the original game's gritty 1970s-esque New York City. In contrast, Human Revolution came with a lot of generic, slightly futuristic office buildings, while the really interesting stuff sat static outside the window. Those cities felt like they'd just been shaken out of a really tight cardboard box and had the styrofoam and plastic wrap removed. They had their moments. Detroit was interesting, but it felt like half of Hengsha was in that Tai Yong Tower. As you walk through this city, and you will do a lot of that in this game, you see the contrast between the centuries-old structures and the new architecture that has risen up and around them. Classical structures dovetail with modern geometric edges, lights, and sounds, with animated displays and advertisements. It seems to me that this Prague had some strong local ordinances to prevent the destruction of the old, as new artists, leaders, and businesses felt inspired to install something fresh and exciting. Through the main quest, you'll leave and return from isolated quest locations that cause time to shift, allowing the city to shine in different ways. Literally. The game opens in broad daylight, which is the first time you'll experience it in a series that's typically cloaked in darkness and blown out by artificial lighting. Prague by day is a visual delight, and as it shifts to night, it not only becomes more reminiscent of those older games, but any missions you've worked on will hop to their next stages. The night shift also summons a metaphorical darkness when you're having to utilize cover and shadow to dodge state police when martial law falls over the town. Prague also, at all times of day, looks uncomfortably cold. No one's exhausting breathy steam, so it's not quite that frigid, but everyone is bundled up. Except the sex workers, they're okay. The implied chill evokes a vibe of nostalgic comfort. I kinda wish the game leaned into it more, especially as temperatures tend to decline at night, but maybe people just dress up in layers at all times of day here. I don't know. Deus Montreal chose Prague as a setting because it's a transient city between Western and Eastern Europe. This made sense because the game was in development during the migratory crisis that Europe was facing as people were fleeing Syria and the Middle East in droves, and the intolerance of nationalistic governments that rose in response to it. You see these in play in Mankind Divided, but in very broad ways. Prague is a city that's extremely wary of its augmented peoples and has very little cool for them. One example, an art gallery featuring artwork created by Augs is beautiful when you first encounter it, but it's smashed up midway through the game as tensions rise in the city. Without a strong municipal government and a state government focused on policing the augmented, the Divaldi crime family runs things here. They even manage a chunk of the town beyond the red light district that you'll get to visit late in the game. Nearly every quest or store you wander into has their influence woven in, and yet my only encounters with Diwali leadership were at the end of gun barrels, and rather unintentionally at that. The Diwali serve as the atmospheric component of the city rather than any specific threat or fixture. It would have been interesting if the game had forced a relationship with them rather than simply being an opponent when the story needed them to be. Being headquartered in a transient city like Prague, the Diwali make some portion of their money trafficking people in, through, and out of the city. They use their uncontested power to extort every last penny from immigrants as they move through. Alongside the Diwali's criminal efforts, there are bad agents who run a document forging business that you can get in the middle of. There's a lot of culture and nuance here, from the art and historical sculptures to how they implemented infrastructure, like the electrical aerials that you'll walk under. There are trees here that look like they're just about to start losing their leaves. Even the virtual people you rub shoulders with seem like real entities with a language barrier that prevents full connection, unless you just happen to know what they're saying as a player. Although I've heard the translations in here can be a bit spotty. There are bicycles here, but never any in use. There are promotional advertisements for events and shows with plenty of location-specific art. This dude's playing video games in this video game. How cool is that? There's so much going on in every frame, or at least the appearance of so much going on. There are named streets with numbers with the occasional need to try and figure them out, but it's mostly decoration. Along them are lots of mostly empty storefronts that invite exploration that's paid off with random items and junk or characters that have nothing to say. It sort of negates the charm of having such an intimate and cultured city when these elements are largely for show. Scissor jacks dot the map, serving as key infrastructure for the game's environmental puzzle platforming. If you have a biocell to spare, you can activate these lifts and figure out how to traverse the city's vertical architecture. While figuring out how to traverse the rooftops and ledges made me feel smart, not enough of the environment was built for this kind of exploration. Successfully accessing some of the upper level apartments for Neuropozyne quests usually involves finding the single intended path up and around the sides of buildings, leaving so many other parts of the architecture out of reach and awkward to navigate while you're up there. Hopefully you have the slow landing AUG activated by this point, or you'll find yourself reloading more often than you'd like. I wish this game had more of this vertical puzzle solving, considering the density and design of the city. Elsewhere, sadly, you can't order a burger at the express burger joint here. There's also this bench installed on an inclined sidewalk, which I don't think would comply with any sensible urban construction standards manual. Prague is not one contiguous zone, but is instead split in half, or rather, 2/3 and 1/3. We'll just call them Big Prague and Little Prague. You transmit between these two sections by a drawn-out subway system that facilitates load screens, but you can also drop into a subway section to train between points within the larger zone as well. The rationale for why is technical. Each section just ate too much RAM. Both Big Prague and Little Prague feature a mixture of residences and shops, but Big Prague by sheer volume has more of the shiny shops and stuff you want to see, like the city's red light district. The team set up big and obvious landmarks and sightlines to help navigation, but I tell you what, I was still getting lost plenty of times even as I'd already played it, which isn't actually a complaint. Beyond Prague, there are a quintet of standalone locations that you'll visit throughout the game, and we'll cover these as we run down the story. Prague is a hub city, but it's not an open world. You're not roaming the countryside or owning property beyond your penthouse. All of the conveyance by vehicle belongs to the cutscenes, and Jensen is never the driver anyway. Prague invites exploration in a way that previous games couldn't provide. It's not just that there's more square footage to meander, it's that there's more volume, more density. Prague is a hub much more than, say, Detroit or Hangshaw from Human Revolution, Cairo from Invisible War, or Hell's Kitchen from the original game, allows for more complex structures between storefronts and public locations above and below ground in a much higher fidelity. Yes, there'll always be a quest marker blooping on your map enticing you to advance a narrative, but take more than a few steps down any of these streets and you'll be quickly invited to explore any number of other options. There are so many nooks, crannies, and backways to explore that it's extremely unlikely you'll uncover them all in a single playthrough. You'll also be left to your own devices to figure out how to access locations, even if the solution isn't some terribly complex thing. You'll also be rewarded for breaching the unknown. Find obscure tunnels or back rooms, you'll get experience points to help you upgrade your character. It encourages you as a player to break down doors and scrunch your way through vents to access weird places that don't seem to belong to anyone. It's even better when you have the augmentation that allows you to punch straight through walls. Vents, the geographical band-aid of the immersive sim subgenre, don't just allow you to warp pipe within complex buildings, but they'll move you between buildings as well. Heck, a vent streaming out of one shop landed me in the administrative back section of the nearby train station. That's heckin' weird and I love it. I wish it happened more often. Below ground, the sewer system will regularly tie into these vent systems while revealing the layers of heroes, villains, and random schmoes who need to escape police state chaos going on topside. Prague's underground becomes its own sub-city. It just needs some teenage mutants to seal the deal. Watching people just vibe down here invites the dream of, hey, maybe it wouldn't be so bad to live down here, at least in a fix. You just have to ignore the humidity and the poo gas, but then again, maybe your brain just numbs the fuck out after a while. After a loud, flashy gunfight against some drones down here, I encountered a group of sewer dwellers who were completely unbothered by the bang-bang action nearby. At least in the original game, they would have the humor to run around in circles nonsensically, screaming in fear. Perhaps the best part of all this exploration is that you don't need to end up somewhere important at the end of a tunnel, breach, or break-in. Often the satisfaction came with winding up in another spot I'd already explored, Minecraft style. Like an open world, however, Prague periodically presents a paralytical amount of options. There are lots of apartments, storage units, and shops to investigate. Before long, the game activates the genre's ImSim fever, where you feel compelled to search every room, open every storage vessel, and plunder everything that isn't nailed down. Thankfully, the game signals what's actually valuable to pick up and sell, because it's very easy to burden your inventory with useless crap. Stepping into just one of these apartment complexes will give you so many of these treasure chests clustered in one spot that you can just move from floor to floor, tediously plundering it all for information and resources in varying quantities. Before long, you'll wonder what's the point of spending so many resources hacking or breaking into them all when you can save them for mission-critical tasks. It becomes a bit like grinding low-level mobs to overlevel your character before tackling a boss. But it's not just loot, ammo, or money that you'll find in the folds of this world. You'll also encounter scads of personal information from people you will never talk to. There are so many half conversations or middle chapters of narrative chains in here that you'll read well out of order or context that it can be confusing and even random. It'll feel like you're missing out on something, but sometimes it'll steer you towards the next step. These tertiary stories and narrative chains become the game's way of backfilling narrative and making the world feel larger. There's even a GDC talk about it. There are also plenty of obstacles in the environment that, like a Metroidvania, require specific augs to bypass. These sections won't have big glowing signs to signal that you can't proceed with your current abilities, at least until you activate your detective vision aug. You'll have to get good at knowing your limits or you'll simply die over and over again. This isn't a problem that the previous, more linear Deus Ex games had to deal with because once you moved on, you didn't have the option to wander back and pick that section clean, at least not usually. In that same unsignaled Metroidvania vein, it's easy to get into spaces and clear them out, only to have to return to them later when they're activated by a quest. It's very video gamey. There are plenty of examples of this, but one that sticks out is when I set my gaze on Prague's large Palisade Bank. I spent well over an hour raiding it room by room, level by level, thoroughly cleansing it of valuables and security guards, but when I came back on an actual quest, I still found bodies and evidence of my tampering, plus plenty of empty drawers from the previous run. Despite my violent first dip, it was a big surprise to not find myself on a wanted poster or targeted for immediate annihilation upon re-entry. While it's neat to see that bodies don't entirely flash out of existence and the game doesn't forget your interference in the smaller details, there's really not any sense of global persistence beyond that. Again, as previous games would just move you on to the next area, being able to return to the same locations over and over in an open environment like this lessens the impact of what you're actually accomplishing beyond the story missions. Okay, but what about when you want to finally engage in the game's authored content, the quests? Alongside the Golden Path, Prague offers a number of substantial side quests that give you a peek into the other machinations of this world going on beside you. While I'm not going to list all of the game's side quests exhaustively, here are some of my favorites. In a corner of the sewer, a megalomaniac has techno-hypnotized a group of people to be a father figure of their tiny underground commune. Jensen even falls under their influence, powerless to fight back in any conventional way. I never uncovered why the hypnotist father dude is doing all this across 2 playthroughs, but it's interesting. There's a new psychotropic drug on the market that might be beneficial to the public, but for now it's killing augmented people in wild parties because of its interactions with neuropozyne. Over a series of quests, you can track down where it's being produced and shut it down. Here's an underground newspaper that needs a scandalous story to avoid uncovering your base of operations. A rogue AI asks you to help them out, luring you from digital signage. It turns out to be a forked version of the Elias Toufexis AI from Picus TV, which only really makes sense if you've played the previous game. It's fun to acquire and try to decrypt what looks like a zip disk from my time in art school. Yes, I am that old. There's been a murder right behind your apartment and you get to play CSI as you gather evidence from the grisly scene and question the police's top suspect. The police would be more than happy to just throw them in the slammer without due process because they're anti-AUG bigots. Several quests will have multiple stages as you play through the game, which ensures you don't rush through them all in one sitting. This gives them more plausibility as time jumps create follow-ups and related tasks. That's neat. But even though these B stories provide an interesting sense of progression and promote some interesting standalone ideas and concepts, they ultimately don't really come across as terribly meaningful. So many start off interesting and then just kind of peter out without providing a substantial conclusion. One of these is an ongoing quest related to your previous boss in Detroit and a key character in Human Revolution, David Seraph. You ask him for help figuring out your augmentations in this game, but it's only over Zoom. It's a few rounds of, here's a little more info before you seek out someone in the city who winds up dead. Despite all the hustling for your old manager, you don't wind up with much more information than you had when you started. In so many ways, these quests line up like the main story. They feel like a lead up to a mid-season break, the other side of which will provide a proper continuation or conclusion. Unfortunately, for this game, that never comes. All of these quests also feel overly scripted and projected. None have the dynamism of a spontaneous event or something happening live in the moment. The bombing of a clockmaker's shop or the riots that lead to the declaration of martial law are handled entirely off screen. There are no kids asking you for candy bars or meetings you can interrupt. Every quest kicks off in very deliberate and projected ways from very specific start points, making the world feel physically and narratively static. Human Revolution was a beautiful game graphically when it came out in 2011, but Mankind Divided looks dramatically better, like a generational leap forward in graphics tech. It's crisper, it's higher fidelity, and it allows the game to chase a more realistic look, whereas its predecessor was a bit more stylish. It's a give and take between what both games accomplish, but holy crap, does this game still look good a decade later. Many of the technological improvements come from an engine change. Human Revolution sourced the Crystal engine from Eidos' stablemate Crystal Dynamics, who were working on Tomb Raider games ahead of that series' reboot. With the arrival of the Xbox One and PlayStation 4, Eidos Montreal wanted to take advantage of their next-generation hardware features in a new Deus Ex game. So they utilized IO Interactive's Glacier 2 engine, which they'd been using for their Hitman games. Eidos Montreal had to extend the engine's functionality so much for Mankind Divided that it wound up becoming a full fork called the Dawn engine. It even gets a spotlight in the overly long logo parade up front. The most drastic difference between these two Montreal games is their shift in art direction. Human Revolution had a very strong black and gold visual motif, From the worlds you wandered through to the user experience to the cutscenes, the game was very thoroughly black darkness highlighted with gold. This also inspired the game's somewhat controversial piss filter that tended to turn everything on the screen into, well, you know, which was stripped out in the game's deluxe director's cut. Mankind Divided chooses to let the world glow with a full palette of colors. This allows the game, and particularly the daylight settings of Prague and Switzerland, to pop visually when they hadn't before in this series. It's easily one of this game's biggest achievements. Characters in Human Revolution were also more stylized, with cartoonish, exaggerated designs and features that were almost weird. Mankind Divided's characters are still a little stylized, but not overly so. A highlight of this contrast between returning characters is Frank Pritchard, who is a main character in this game's System Rift downloadable expansion. He looks less like a pirate now and more proportionate and, you know, normal. Another big push in Montreal's first game, maybe one of the boldest, was the Renaissance-styled and geometrically themed clothing utilized by society's elite that contrasted with the drab utilitarian wardrobes of the original game. It was a very interesting idea, something that rhymed with the beautiful fashion of the Star Wars prequel trilogy that was systematically dismantled by the drabby utilitarian wardrobes of the original trilogy. Mankind Divided works to bridge the difference in fashion with the occasional odd take, like Shadow Child's flappy wardrobe held together by random straps. The levels of this sequel also look more practical, in large part because of the more historic, realistic setting. Like the wardrobes, there's less emphasis here on hypermodern, Zaha Hadid-inspired structures and geometric designs. There are still plenty of boldly modern structures and designs in here, but it's not so overwhelming that it feels impossibly futuristic like the first game. In the sequel, modern amenities feel like additions rather than the main course aesthetically. The bathrooms of the Diwali crime organization are pretty dope, inspired by early 20th century design that predates Art Deco, which has been a trope of so many immersive sims since BioShock came out. Ceilings, an oft neglected surface in video games because of the modern shooter's emphasis on what's going on at eye level, were given so much attention in Human Revolution. This carries on here, but with so much more detail everywhere in every environment, they don't draw as much attention as they once did. Mankind Divided instead loves to experiment with outdoor installations, like the Fremont Street-esque digital billboards and displays, or these very strange ads for mental health services depicting people flinging themselves off buildings. If this game's tone weren't so serious, they might elicit a chuckle instead of being darkly dystopian. That said, an advantage of setting this game almost entirely in Prague and Central Europe is that it excuses the fact that it's stylistically consistent throughout. Nearly all of the architecture of Human Revolution felt eerily similar, despite taking place in far-flung cities and locations around the world, making it visually and implausibly monotonous at times. And so we have a more realistic looking game with more details like frosted glass and diffuse lighting, and more realistic characters and environments. But there's also so many small details in this world. You can see small pens and office supplies just hanging out. There are haphazard cable runs everywhere and doodled whiteboards. Bathrooms look beautiful and ugly, even sporting uncomfortable looking rectangular seats, which I totally forgot were in this game when playing Cyberpunk 2077. I love how full this world is, which lends it authenticity, but some areas have so much to look at that they seem overly decorated for the sake of it. These environments also draw a much more sensible balance between being a nearly completely static world that looks pretty, like we had in Human Revolution, and one that's completely interactive and computationally expensive. The original Deus Ex worked by making nearly everything interactive, destructible, or accessible, but the trade-off was that they couldn't put that many objects in the world, leaving them feeling oddly spare and empty. As technology advanced, Eidos Montreal could fill the world with polygonal detail, but it had to lock it down because the implications of interacting with it all was immense on Xbox 360 era hardware. Now, with the extra horsepower, you can interact with a lot of the stuff in here, even if the more intricate details are still locked down. It's a huge step up in realism, although a lot of this stuff is useless garbage. Of course, as you play detective in this game searching for small clues, it's easier than ever to get lost with all of the detail. To that end, the game offers an optional augmentation that gives you a kind of detective vision to see through all the world's props, to find the most essential components, including enemies through walls and environmental hazards. Call it cheating, call it cliche, but it's also entirely optional. All this being said, the trade-off in shedding Human Revolution's distinct and stylized art direction for one that's more realistic is that the world moment to moment is less distinct visually. It's almost grungy in appearance. I could understand if people felt that the geometric facets and sculpture or the black and gold look of Human Revolution was overdone, but I had fewer oh wow moments moving through Mankind Divided despite the clear advances artistically overall. 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, I suppose. The city's biggest, most interesting modern feature, the Palisade Bank Blade building, is a striking fixture around town, but it's distinctive in another way beyond its unnaturally long cantilevered form. The game doesn't know where it's supposed to be. When you're in Big Prague, it's along the north shore pointing southeast. When you're in Little Prague, it's to the west pointing northeast. Arriving in Prague at the beginning of the game, it's oriented on the left side of the screen, but later on, the subway map indicates that the Rizika station is located to the east, so this validates the small Prague orientation. It's also oddly disproportionate at scale to what you experience in the DLC content, but you know, whatever. This is all about keeping that plank in your view no matter where you are, I guess. Separately, the team had to build out an entire look for their virtual levels, which is ironically a first in a game series that's heavily inspired by cyberpunk fiction. The Eidos Montreal game's geometric aesthetic is blended with a white motif that looks like frames of Tron but with inverted colors to create a very compelling vibe. My favorite little visual element of this whole scheme are the ribbed glass windows. They are so freaking cool. These closed environments match the things you can expect to do in their real world, like hack stuff, shoot stuff, and snap to cover. It's easy to imagine with a little more scope and/or money, they could have grand virtual vistas and whatever. Despite how important it was for the team to create this look, the most exciting virtual sequence is a very brief but cinematic slice during the story campaign. If you're hungry for more of it, you can sip up another brief segment during the System Rift expansion, or you can eat as much as you'd want in the standalone Breach mode. And yeah, we can talk about that later. But Mankind Divided has another huge artistic win: the user experience and interface. Prominently featuring Gotham on blackboarding, all the game's menus lose the golden framing and frilly fringing of its predecessor in favor of a stark minimalist look that was in vogue at the time. It's very clean and very simple all around, ensuring you're not going to get stuck doing or finding what you need. But then for some reason they decided to make the hacking minigame more complicated visually with a full 3D presentation versus the flatter presentation of Human Revolution. Playing on PC using keyboard and mouse is fine for aiming, but playing on controller seems to work a lot better for nearly everything else, especially the game's radial menus to assign powers and select weapons. You can assign your weapons and items to your number row, but putting your augmentation powers on the function row, it sucks. Not helping is that so many of these augs seem like they should be passively engaged all the time, especially the stealth ones, rather than requiring a toggle on and off. The game's main menu system is the typical tabbed interface that you'll engage with regularly to manage your inventory, check the map, manage augmentations, catalog quest items, and more. It's fine, it works. Even if you've never played an immersive sim before, this will be immediately intuitive. From the very first moments of the game in Dubai, the Dawn engine allows for much more complicated lighting and geometry over the Crystal engine. There's so much fluttering netting and high-resolution signage that it's really freaking impressive even by today's standards. But even when it was released, there were parts of the presentation that felt like chopped off corners to keep the game running smoothly everywhere else. One of these are the head models for other characters. While protagonist and player character Adam Jensen has inherited Square-Enix ImageWorks' high-detailed CGI model from the cutscenes of Human Revolution, it becomes clear that there are tiers of less cared-for characters beyond that. Having NPCs with different facial animation qualities is normal in video games, but you'll see this spread pretty easily in the home office of Task Force 29, Jensen's employer. Director Miller looks good, but even a quest-giving coworker like Peter Chang looks like an animating hydraulic puppet with all the clicks and hisses edited out. Like Human Revolution, the game is keen to recycle models. One of them, strangely, is one of your coworkers at TF29, who is also a cultist chilling in your apartment's courtyard. I had to do a double take when I saw her in my original playthrough. It seems like it should be an important, truly top-tier priority to make the story's most important people visually distinct from the plebes in the street. I realized that this, among so many aspects tied to the game's narrative, is related to them just getting the game out the door. Aside from the split between Big Prague and Little Prague, it's impressive how much of the game world is available to explore without interruption. Even as you move in and out of buildings or up and down from sewers, there are no load zones to hold you up, even if a couple are cleverly masked. Like the character faces, however, you'll notice that the larger the space you're in, the smaller the number of assets the game can show on screen. This wouldn't be noticeable overall, except that smaller, more intimate areas like Golem City and TF29's base are dramatically more detailed than Prague's side streets, which are very simple in comparison. It definitely affects the mood of the game to see one spot look relatively standard while another looks like a detailed Hollywood production, even if the inconsistency is completely understandable. Physics are fun to mess with here. You'll have your ragdolls per usual, but when you need to toss world junk or dislodge a big box that's blocking a vent, seeing them fly around is such a joy. This game could use a bit more joy. But there are some discrete technical issues in this game. Minor ones include the fact that the environmental skybox tends to disappear while looking through drone and turret viewports when using security terminals. I remember the hair tech being a big deal when it released, but it always looks overly bright compared to the skin texture or the surrounding background, like it's being given a 50% brightness boost before it being pasted on at the end of the render pipeline. It looks weird. Characters in Human Revolution wore trench coats and overcoats that were too large for their characters, presumably to avoid geometry conflicts. Here, those coats are properly proportioned, but hair and chins now clip through collars. Can't win either way, I guess. There's also an electronics score in here that seems to work well enough, but I can't remember any of it. Michael McCann was the principal composer for Human Revolution, and his theme for it is incredible, but he wasn't terribly involved with this second game. And so the score for Mankind Divided mimics that vibe and sound, and isn't otherwise offensive, but it also doesn't stand out. It actually sort of just fills space, which some people clamor for, technically, but probably not the ones who enjoyed McCann's score for Human Revolution so much. My biggest issue with this game, however, was just getting it running. Despite being a relatively modern game, performance struggled often and inconsistently, especially as I was capturing footage. It was so strange that upon starting the game, it struggled to run in 4K when my machine almost ran it in 4K a decade ago when it came out. This game crashed several times and characters would pop in and out when performance dipped. An early recommendation that helped was turning off the game's MSAA processing, which has apparently been an issue for the game since it was released. Moving through Dubai and into Prague, and then periodically from there, the game ran like trash. The worst part was during the train station sequence with Alex, which is a real-time sequence before it seamlessly transitions to a pre-rendered cinematic when the bombing happens. I was genuinely concerned that if some minor graphical tweaks didn't fix the issue, I wouldn't be able to play the game at all. Some people online testified that they had issues running it in late-stage Prague. Somehow, the game worked well enough that I was able to run it in 4K throughout and finish the game without it breaking, but it was scary there for a bit. But then as I started a New Game Plus run without Shadowplay recording it, performance seemed consistently good. What wasn't scary, but was incredibly annoying for a game in 2025 on a machine with NVMe drives, is that initial load times are also absolutely trash. Even when the game tells you it's loaded, I would have to repeatedly hit the space bar for the game to actually bring up the game. On the plus side, the game's triangular loading animation icon is so heckin' cool. Beyond the broad technical stuff that created performance issues and characters having issues navigating environments or your generic video game physics trouble, I encountered few actual bugs. This one Diwali guard was invisible, stomping around and shooting at me, and it took me far too long to find him because he'd gotten stuck in the stairs, only occasionally peeking out to get me. Here is a random light source flying around the level chaotically. That's fun. But as stunning and culturally stuffed as Prague is, it's not always a blast. The map is mostly helpful, but it's also a struggle to use sometimes. The zoom is sluggish and unresponsive. Mission nodes pulse on the map but don't indicate what quest it's for until you center your viewport on it. This is maybe intuitive with a controller, but it doesn't make much sense when you've got a mouse that can hover over everything. The persistent in-world minimap doesn't point you toward your selected mission, so you have to bring it up on the big map if you don't remember where it's at. But my biggest critique of this game's wayfinding is actually the fact that there isn't enough detective work required in here. Part of the original game's charm, something common in games from its era like Thief, is that you'd get some scratchy looking map and have to figure stuff out on your own. You get a couple of these hand-drawn maps in Mankind Divided as part of quest lines that require you to figure out where, say, a cache is. Unfortunately, the game will then put a big glowing node on your map anyway, eliminating any need to figure things out on your own. It makes it easier for novice gamers, but still robs players of some of the joy of the series. That sucks. But my biggest issue with Prague is that despite all of the time I spent in it, I never felt connected to it as a player. Sure, I got used to the streets, where my vendors were at, experiments with climbing around and stuff, admired how pretty stuff was, the usual, but Prague as a setting often felt adversarial. This was also largely by design in service of the game's heavy-handed apartheid themes. I felt little connection to the people here or the place. Even though all the main characters speak clear English, the language barrier is a struggle. Jensen's personal disconnection from the city is another issue. There's also a large oppressive police presence everywhere in this city. There's always a feeling of being watched and the persistent threat of being painfully punished on a whim. You can be shot to death for jumping on a cop car, for instance. Despite this, there's no real threat meter unless you commit violence with an eye shot or, hop on one of their cars. But then, I would steal stuff in front of them and they wouldn't care at all. There's no way to gain or lose favor with them to make things easier or harder. There's no star system or system of escalation or de-escalation. It is very simple. You do something wrong and you get punished immediately, or you hide until the threat meter disappears, and then they forget you caused an issue at all. In one instance, I accidentally killed one of the game's rare general goods vendors and their entire squad because I accidentally tripped a laser in a vent. I mean, what else was I going to do? Even with all the combat and the ruckus that went with it, and despite the fact that it was in a high-end apartment complex in broad daylight, the police didn't show up at all. Like, the cops are almost entirely ornamental and outside. They're not interested in solving crime or whatever, just oppressing people. The police are also openly corrupt, allowing enterprising shitheads to openly don their uniforms and extort fees from civilians. My favorite part is when you convince a cop that one of their own is actually doing it with receipts, and they summon an army of peers and their drones to mow down the fake cops in the street. There's no justice or arrests or whatever, they just get obliterated. It's actually kind of awesome. And finally, even though we've already established why they did it, I wish the two Prague sections were one big map and not split in half. It adds a hurdle to navigation and slows down exploration. It also just slows down the game arbitrarily. If there's one person who has the credentials to move about freely in this world, it's absolutely our sunglasses at night protagonist.
He does this to dozens of people a day. intimidates them into paying him over and over. He preys on their fears of being deported. In a perfect world, someone would stand up to him. Someone like you, maybe?
The game's hero and player character, Adam Jensen, is Inspector Gadget for the post-Matrix era. He's an augmented cop with a fancy trench coat. In fact, you get a selection of trench coats in this sequel. Jensen's brow is almost permanently scrunched, his dialogue is gruff. He is a gritty dude in a smooth package. If you play the two games he stars in with the mindset that he's a barely costumed Batman, you get the gist. Like Batman, he hides any moment of emotional output with a mask. In Jensen's case, it's by activating his built-in sunglasses. Thwip! But who is Adam Jensen anyway? For starters, he's a former SWAT officer from Detroit with a controversial track record. His former coworkers give him shit about it early in Human Revolution when you show up in your new role as the chief of security for Seraph Industries, a company that's cashing in huge on the human augmentation craze. Adam's former beau, Dr. Megan Reed, is Seraph's augmentation genius, and the two of you are about to jet off to a conference in Washington, D.C. when terrorists arrive to kill you. Reed is assumed dead. She's not actually, she's just working for the bad guys, but Seraph has your damaged virgin flesh sliced away and remade with technology as he augments you to an extreme. Now you're back thwipping your shades closed with a bunch of superpowers you unlock over the course of the game. Blah blah blah, story of Human Revolution, and then the AUG incident. And then you decide the fate of the world in a single room inside the Panchaea megastructure at the very end of the game. Afterward, you fall into the ocean and Mankind Divided picks up 2 years on from that. Despite basically saving the world at the end of the previous game, Jensen returns to work as a detective with the kind of fifth freedoms that would make Sam Fisher sweat. Maybe he likes the mid-level tasking of Task Force 29, a division of Interpol, or he feels more like a follower than a leader, but it still feels like a huge narrative demotion. This plot contrivance fuels other issues, like the fact that the game has little interest in backfilling what happened to Jensen in the 2 years between games. He was scooped from the ocean and spent something like a year in Alaska recovering from the ordeal, having experimental AUGs installed, again, without his consent. He joins TF-29 about 6 months before the events of this game, and at the same time, builds a relationship with the Juggernaut Collective, an underground mob of hackers out for some populist justice. This slice of his history is so vague that it's both confusing and uninteresting at the same time. Of course, joining Jensen at this seemingly arbitrary point allows the game to surround you with a ton of characters you already know as a character, but not as a player. This may seem pedantic because you're always introduced to a new cast of coworkers in each individual game, but other Deus Ex games felt more compelled to introduce them rather than treat them as established characters. All this works well to set up tension around the fact that Jensen is the only augmented agent in this office. As Mankind Divided opens, Jensen and a strike force are headed to Dubai to interdict a weapons deal. His non-augmented co-workers are more than happy to provide helpful passive-aggressive banter ahead of their critical work. The mission closes out with augmented dudes in angular gold masks raiding the meeting and no one knows why. Yet. But here's the thing. Why You're in Dubai comes off like a convoluted network TV crime procedural show that's not interesting in the slightest. It's got the graying boss dude, an infographic-filled briefing on a huge digital projection, and a bunch of minor characters that amount to very little plot-wise. Like Human Revolution, Eidos Montreal confuses building a story with lots of narrative pieces with being deep or impactful. More often than not, it's just confusing and weird. All of this just feels like a thin rationalization to justify an opening tutorial mission that has to work so hard to teach the player so many different mechanics, especially if they're new to the franchise. This is a long and dense learning tunnel if you aren't just skipping through it. They do not want to give you any sense whatsoever that you are missing out on any of the mechanics or nuance of how this game plays. The worst part of it all might be the fact that, in the end, this tiny vestibule of a tutorial mission amounts to so little for all the attention that the game's story gives it. It doesn't kick off some incredibly intriguing thing like a snowball tumbling down a mountain, gaining mass and momentum. It just feels like content. You make your way back to Prague, which is TF-29's headquarters, and meet with Alex, the only friend you seem to have in the world, and your sole connection to the Juggernaut Collective, which stands in opposition to the international police force that cuts your paychecks. Immediately after this encounter, there's a bombing at the train station, which is an initial event that actually kicks off the game's story. But in refusing to rise above a middling narrative slurry, the game fails to raise any kind of emotional stakes at any point. Some kid's parent is trapped in the rubble of this bombing, and it has the emotional impact of me reading this line. The one I'm reading right now. Like, this parent or guardian is dead. It doesn't just ask who cares. It asks broadly with the widest lens, who cares? But you care as a player because your OGs are now majorly messed up and not working, producing all kinds of annoying UI glitches. The tutorial teaches you about all of the game's essential powers and abilities by giving you all of them up front, and then to give any semblance of agency or progression, the game resets them so you have a reason to rebuild Adam Jensen as you see fit. While the game doesn't outright force you to avoid working on quests until you get with your twitchy underground street doctor to get your OGs working again, it does strongly signal it. Do what you want, but you should really get them fixed right away, if only because you'll keep dying over and over again since you have few skills to effectively defend yourself or attack with. Adam Jensen is what is commonly known in video gaming as a blank or null protagonist. Like other Deus Ex protagonists, he isn't as silent or unambitious as player characters like Half-Life's Gordon Freeman or Doom's Doom Guy, but his persona and ambitions are left as vacant as possible to allow the player to project their ambitions upon him. But a dissonance emerges in games like these when player choices are narrowed for the sake of telling a story, and given the ability, the player would have chosen to do something other than what the game is laying out for them. It's a hard balance to maintain. Jensen gets to skirt around this for the most part by being an invincible augmented Superman. Yeah, you have plenty of opportunities to fail moment to moment, especially before you've built out your suite of powerful abilities, but when the story kicks in and the odds should be stacked against him, they aren't. He can't really lose in a conflict because he's always playing all sides. As an augmented agent, he has no need for regular neuropozyne injections to keep physically stable. It avoids annoying gameplay like popping pills regularly to fight the effects of malaria in Far Cry 2, but it also makes him less interesting as a character. Jensen is regularly grilled about being an AUG, like in your frequent subway trips, but to what end? He can't contest these checkpoints or push back against derogatory anti-AUG comments, so there is no choice and therefore no consequence. He just has to take it all, and by proxy, so does the player. Jensen has an apartment that's fancier and moodier than your neighbors, which feel copy and pasted, minus their contents, and you'll encounter quite a few of them over the course of the game. Your bedroom's floorboards conceal a hidden compartment where you'll find literature that further illuminates Jensen's dual loyalties provided by the Juggernaut Collective and Frank Pritchard. Yes, Frank Pritchard, your helpful foil from the previous game, is more than happy to muddy the waters when it comes to global powers. I mean, he lost his job with the collapse of Seraph Industries following the AUG incident too. He's such a fucking bro. There are even Juggernaut Collective drops outlined in this cache that I never used or even know what they do. I'm not even going to bother to find out. Even as this blank character, it's hard to imagine that Jensen isn't affected by the events of the world as you play through it. Often he seems nonplussed by even the largest revelations, merely acting as a reporter of what he sees and experiences. He has opinions about this world and what's going on, but what are they based on? Vague ideas of order and good? How does he define these things? Through the DLC story expansions, we do get brief windows into a more expressive Jensen, but they're just that, brief. Like JC Denton before him and literally after him, Jensen is on a roller coaster of missions and choices that try to give the player choice, while also steering them toward a predetermined set of conclusions. Of my many complaints of the story, a primary one is its rigidity, which prevents the player from making any real consequential choices. Very few characters are affected by things he does and the decisions Jensen makes. A barely opinionated Jensen lacking much in the way of decisions sits in a weird space, place where he's a mere observer of what's happening to him and around him. As a result, he becomes a powerful tool for other groups' ambitions, which, ironically, winds up being a huge theme of the game. To that end, much of the story wraps around Jensen's loyalties to two diametrically opposed groups. He works for this international police organization that's being guided by the ethereal Illuminati, but he also collaborates and feeds information to the Juggernaut Collective, which is helmed by a similarly ethereal, shape-shifting artificial intelligence named Janus. And yet, despite this interesting premise, despite the higher fidelity of this game's production values versus the original game, despite this being an open world game full of possibility, your choices are relatively railroaded. He has to install a chip to tap into your boss's phone calls at TF-29. He has to feed information to Janus. He has to go to Switzerland to confront an augmented tank man. It seems unbelievable that Jensen, as a character, wouldn't be displaying some sort of interest in swaying one way or another. You get exactly one branching moment in this story where you get to pick between following your boss's orders or chasing down one of Janus's leads, and the bumpers are so firmly installed that the worst consequence you get is some minor static from a character on either side before ultimately reaching the exact same point in the story. You don't get to play with factions or morality. There are no dark and light side points, no pros and cons. Maybe that's the flashing lights theme of the whole thing, that despite how many choices you ultimately have to make, nothing actually changes, but that doesn't make for the best gameplay in a genre built on player choice. Pre-Montreal Deus Ex games also had this issue, where despite your agency, you're still being funneled towards a conclusion, but those games worked so much harder to make your choices meaningful. Deus Ex and its sequel Invisible War worked hard to provide constant opportunities for you to reach a conclusion that felt like you were deciding it as a player. Many of these issues of agency are ones that Human Revolution also suffered from, with its overly stiff and needlessly complicated narrative. The game was properly grilled by making its multiple endings a mere switchbox in the final moments. This wasn't just cheesy in how it was presented to the player, it demonstrated that the game hadn't done nearly enough work to that point to justify any of those choices. It's even worse in Mankind Divided because its conclusion is the most disappointing of the whole series. And all of this leads me to my biggest question. Why did they need to bring Adam Jensen back for this game at all? If you know about Deus Ex, then Adam Jensen is really recognizable as the series' mascot. He's the main figure in the key art for both games, dead center, action pose. He's the marketable character who says the line you know, even if you don't know him or the game. The two Jensen games combined sold 6 times as many copies as Ion Storm's original titles, which are the games that created this series' firm hardcore fanbase and storied reputation for gameplay. And yet Jensen is the dude of these games, not this guy. I know the sample size is small, but before Mankind Divided, each Deus Ex game featured a different protagonist. Looking through this very reductionist lens while playing Mankind Divided, it doesn't take much to see that Jensen's inclusion in this game was not the original plan. The less attentive will hand-wave this away, that this was designed to be a trilogy, so of course Jensen had to be the protagonist of this game, the face of the series. He had to. But there's a problem with this line of thinking. These Eidos Montreal games weren't planned as a trilogy. Adam Jensen's voice actor, Elias Toufexis, explained that Eidos Montreal was going to build a whole new Deus Ex game with another character at the helm, as is Deus Ex tradition, until Square-Enix's marketing department said, "No, you've already basically built a new franchise around this new Luke Skywalker-esque figure, you can't just toss him in the bin." Or the ocean. And so Eidos Montreal's second Deus Ex game became a sequel to Human Revolution and Adam Jensen. Playing Mankind Divided nearly a decade after its release, nearly a decade after I originally reviewed it, Jensen's inclusion here is one of the biggest whoa shit revelations of my second playthrough. You see, I'm re-reviewing this because that original review just wasn't very good. People complain about these long multi-hour videos, but back when I was making shorter videos, I really wasn't addressing them the way that I can now. I was scratching the surface on so many issues, breezing past them. Something like a third of that review is me reviewing the Deus Ex series as a whole, leaving my observations of this game in the margins. So many of the questions I raised in that review were ones I could have answered if I'd simply reviewed Mankind Divided 9 years later, after I produced 19 other reviews. So here we are. Mankind Divided makes so much more sense as a story and as an installment of this series if you imagine that the protagonist isn't Adam Jensen, but a new character entirely. The story has other big issues that we'll get into, but this single item is fundamental to why it doesn't work very well. Adam Jensen couldn't prevent the Aug incident, but he was the single determining figure in what came after. He was also the last person to speak to Hugh Darrow, the father of augmentation. Undoubtedly, he's been under surveillance in various times and locations, having been the common thread between so many of the important events of that game. That said, it's plausible to handwave away Jensen's involvement on Panchaea, the climactic epicenter of the game, because it was a clandestine affair, the news of which was buried by the societal chaos that followed. Jensen should have disappeared afterward, sinking to the bottom of the ocean after his tasks had been completed. And yet, a mere 2 years later, Jensen is operating in the open and unrecognized, despite his distinct and unchanged visage, featuring his dagger-shaped goatee and shades as a low-level detective. In this time, not only was he brought back from the dead, retrained, augmented, incorporated into TF-29, and stationed in Prague, he also had to establish a rapport with his co-workers, even if some of them are kind of aggressive about his presence. Not only that, but he would have also needed to establish a connection to and build a rapport with Alex and the Juggernaut Collective. How he could have possibly done all this in 2 years is something the story conveniently chooses to firmly ignore. Surely some amateur internet detective group would have pieced together that Jensen was at the center of all these world-shaping events and was magically alive again running around Europe. How is there not a journalist corps dogging him at every turn, asking him questions about how he ultimately changed the world? How is he not the center of a press conference where he has to justify his choice on the Decidetron at the end of Human Revolution? To that end, how in the world are the Illuminati not talking about this dude from the start? Oh, wait, we'll talk about that in a few hours. Let's go back a chapter to when I talked about my disconnection from Prague as a player. Despite living here, Jensen has no places to hang out at beyond his work office or his penthouse apartment. He has no friends that aren't TF-29 co-workers. His single contact with the Juggernaut Collective seems more like an acquaintance than anything. He has no favorite bars or stores. Everyone treats him like a stranger, as though they're meeting him for the first time, like the player themselves. No one yells out, "Adam Jensen," and wraps a warm, friendly arm around him. Adam has no personal observations or commentary about the town and its unique landmarks. Prague doesn't feel like a place he calls home. There's too much evidence that Adam walks around and talks to people to conclude that he's a homebody who doesn't care about the outside world or meeting with people. This approach feels okay when you're visiting a ton of different cities over the course of a game, but taking place in a single city that he spent so much time in, it feels so strange. He has no attachment to it. Not only does Adam have little connection to the characters in Prague, he has basically no connection to characters from the previous game that would ground him in this universe. He chats with his former boss, David Seraph, in a questline that feels tacked on. Seraph literally phones it in, and the result of his quest chain is inconsequential to anything else that happens in the game. Frank Pritchard is here, but only briefly in the DLC. It's easy to believe that any attempt to tie this game's protagonist to the cast of the first game was done late in development. And so it makes far more sense that Adam Jensen's character was supposed to be someone who had been with TF-29 far longer, who had lived in Prague far longer, who had been connected to Alex and the Juggernaut Collective far longer. Adam Jensen wasn't supposed to be in this game at all. He was supposed to be dead, at the bottom of an ocean, so his inclusion conclusion truly feels like a marketing push to build on the sales momentum of Human Revolution. Even with all the contortion they had to do with the story to get it to work, that contortion is still incredibly apparent. And this is all in service of bridging this game to the future, to the Illuminati, to JC Denton and beyond, and the very weird ways that this game tries to do it, successfully and not.
The odd incident has caused a schism in society. Things are worse than we projected, and growing more unstable every day.
In the Deus Ex universe, the world is ruled by a secretive council of world-shaping tech trillionaires known as the Illuminati. You know, like the conspiracy theory. In the original game, this group is run by Bob Page, but in this prequel-era golden age, decades before JC Denton's ascension, Bob Page hangs on the shoulder of the council's power, ready to pounce. The ancient Lucius de Beers runs this council and steers its direction with the vaguest commands on the most unurgent timelines. The meetings portrayed in this game clearly could have been emails. Human Revolution teases Bob Page and this council briefly in its bookends, but it's not until this game that the Illuminati gets a full presentation and a sense that the protagonist has crossed paths with it. The council on display is a gallery of references to important historical figures in the original game, which gives this game some huge weight and structure as a bridge to 2054. It may not make any sense to the vast majority of players who are coming to it new, but for returning players, it's like watching Revenge of the Sith, knowing that it has to bridge the chasm between Anakin Skywalker good and Darth Vader bad. It feels important to finally see De Beers, Everett, Page, and Manderley in a prequel to Deus Ex, and so it's these small handful of cutscenes that justify the game's position as a middle chapter in a previously undesigned Jensen trilogy. And bear in mind, by all accounts, Deus Montreal had no firm footing for how they would get between this game and the original game narratively, even as fans clamor for it so loudly still. And so it follows that the best parts of this game are the ones where we, metaphorically speaking, are beginning to see Anakin become Darth Vader as the Illuminati reveals itself. Task Force 29, the game's prequelized version of the United Nations Anti-Terrorist Coalition, is being steered by the Illuminati, and one of this game's narrative threads is finding out how and why without arriving much at the way of conclusions. Jensen works for them somehow. TF-29 is a well-funded international police unit headquartered in Prague, so it makes sense that it would have a gorgeous underground office. It's only accessible by a hidden elevator in the back of an import-export office, but let's not mind that this elevator is clearly within the sightline of anyone passing by in the street outside. Don't worry about that. When you do arrive underground, you'll notice immediately that this office is so loaded to the gills with detail that it'll distract you from the fact that there really isn't anything you can do down here. Despite being layers of offices that ring an open cubicle farm, and despite there being so many people here, this office has very little functionality at all. There's a shooting range that you can pop off some shots at, but there's also a jail with interrogation rooms down here that the story does absolutely nothing with. There's no Sam Carter to gum it up with about the old days. There's no women's bathroom-esque clever moment that your boss will call out. UNATCO knew what was up. There are some ancient hallways that this structure just happened to intersect with when they built it, and that's pretty cool. The point of this office really is to interact with the designated co-workers who advance the main quest, dole out side quests, and otherwise serve as flavor. So let's introduce the TF-29 crew. Jim Miller is the Australian director of Task Force 29. In my original review, I said he was a forgettable character, a boss man who points you in a direction and tells you to do it. In reality, he may be the best written character in the game. He's a middle manager who has to both abide by the directives of his superiors, even if they're blatant lies and misdirections, while also managing his staff, one of whom is this player-directed free-thinking augmented warrior. You break into his apartment at a point and can catch a glimpse into the messy relationship he has with his ex-husband and kids back home. Every engagement you have with Miller involves him being in this multi-dimensional push and pull with forces known and unknown. The fact that he yells at Jensen so little highlights how much trust Miller has in him.
Yes, He ordered me to do it, but unlike him, I will not ignore evidence to close a case. You've been nothing but an insubordinate cock-up since Manderley put you into this unit.
Despite his frustration with Jensen, it's clear that he has faith in him, his leads, and his intuition. From Jensen's perspective, and really ours as the player, no one else seems to be doing much work in this organization, so Miller definitely has a lot of slack to cut for Jensen. Duncan MacReady would be a far more interesting character if he had anything to do. Peter Serafanowicz's performance is delightful, but MacReady is truly left on the shelf here. Among your co-workers, he's perhaps the most paranoid about Jensen, feeling him out in every which way he can. His snippy banter with Jensen is his most interesting characteristic, placing him in the Pritchard foil slot for this game. Unfortunately for him and us, Miller puts MacReady in charge of investigating what happened in the opening Dubai mission rather than anything meaningful that happens in the story. This means that anytime you encounter him, he's frustrated about his investigation's lack of progress.
Is there something I can help you with, Agent?
I hear you're on point looking into the gold mask mercs that hit us in Dubai. Any leads yet?
Christ, I know I'm good, Jensen, but I've only been on it for 5 minutes.
Meanwhile, you're out running circles around him, figuring shit out in Prague, with a narrative that spirals so far beyond the events of the tutorial. Beyond Dubai, the only time you actually work with MacReady again is in the final London mission, and he's only ever present over comms. Like so many aspects of this game, his potential is truly wasted. Then there's your pilot, Elias Chicane, who has a mandatory role in this series. You may not be flying around the world, but you do have to occasionally skip around Europe, and he's your guy to do it. He walks with a leg brace and a limp after an injury, similar to Hugh Darrow in Human Revolution, but he refuses augmentation to repair or replace it. Chicane has a chip on his shoulder about augmentations and the augmented, but he isn't as dickish about it as MacReady is.
See, back then, nobody could compete with you Augs when it came to manual labor jobs. So, he made a choice, if you can call it that.
Peter Chang is a former prisoner, presumably for white-collar crimes, who's paying his debt to society by being the agency's hacker dude. He's paranoid about everything and enlists Jensen in large part to assuage his fears.
The thought of someone knowing where we are, I'm supposed to be digging into this Janus hacking collective, but I can't do that if I keep looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next bomb to go off.
Daniel Fletcher, better known as Smiley, is this team's animated forensic analyst. He'd fit right in with the Big Bang Theory crew and all the canned laughter that goes along with it.
One minute I'm in there running the show, and the next they accuse me of trying to tamper with evidence. Me! Can you believe that? I would never do that, Adam, never!
And then there's Delara, the workplace shrink, who's introduced as a kind of foil after you revisit the train station bombing site. I mean, she's not really a foil, but anytime she's around, Jensen pitches up like a panicking cat. It's not explained at all, and it feels artificial and weird. It's eventually revealed that she's part of the Illuminati, serving as Lucius de Beer's mole, but to what end, it's not clear. Since I already knew this going into the second playthrough, it made her side quest to go find Vincent Black feel like more of a distraction than a Shrink's genuine attempt to track down a potentially compromised cop who's been deeply undercover for too long.
Well, listen, Adam, Lyon's waiting on my initial batch of reports, and I'm sure Director Miller wouldn't be too pleased to find us standing in his office, so unless there's something else, I think this is where I'll check out.
Outside of Task Force 29 is Alex, your periodic connection to the Juggernaut Collective. She used to work for Bell Tower, the big private security company from the previous game, before they were purchased and dissolved, and that's kinda it. She's an important component to this story, but she barely rises above sidekick territory in terms of character development. Jensen meets with her in a discreet location, she decloaks, they trade information, and then she disappears.
Brown's been selling investors a pumped-up dream. The corporate city-state where like-minded individuals govern themselves while investors reap the profits.
But even if you can set aside those issues, the game struggles with how it tries to tell a Deus Ex story. The characters of this world, for example, aren't characters, they're just people. They're boring. And then the ones that are interesting get precious little screen time. By and large, these characters are easy to glaze over and easy to forget. Not helping this cast of NPCs is this game's overly serious tone. There's no intentional humor in this game at all, and the dialogue is stiff as a board. The story itself is so serious and handled with such urgency, and yet it's so fucking boring. There's so little charm among this cast or how they participate in this narrative that it's easy for big plot points to fall right out of your head or to wonder why you're doing any particular quest. People may not want to admit it, but the original Deus Ex was actually kinda campy. It's not quite the Batman TV series from the 60s, but it sports its own distinct kind of camp that a smaller budget and a more clever team can produce. It had some mustache-twirling villains who didn't quite chew up the scenery, but they sure tried. The most interesting performance in here, then, is the few snippets we get from Cliff Stevens' Bob Page as he smacks down a boring bureaucratic rendition of Joseph Manderley, who's been liberated of his wise affectation from the original game.
Killing Rucker. Are you sure it's a good idea? I mean, it'll certainly make things easier during Phase 2, but...
Are you doubting me, Joseph?
Remember that so much of the original game's voice cast, beyond the principal characters, was provided by development staff and whoever was available. Tom Hall, the brainchild behind Ion Storm, Dallas' and Acronox, provides Walton Simon's Menace with his underplayed and monotone delivery. When you consider how that game came together and the tone they were shooting for, it fits right in. The closest that Eidos Montreal approaches this level of self-aware performative camp is with Francis Pritchard. There are some Human Revolution fans who seem to really enjoy Pritchard's antagonism, and while I thought it was a bit annoying in that game, his teamwork here is a highlight, however brief it is. And the thing is, this is a huge hub, an open world-ish. There are so many opportunities that this game had to get weird and buff out the Golden Path's hard edges, and it whiffs the opportunity almost entirely. The shopkeepers are just holding space. The civilians never spill their drinks. The side quests that do stand out are enjoyable, but never terribly fun. This game is so stoic that it doesn't ever have permission to enjoy itself. A stoic, super serious narrative on its own is okay. A recent example would be Andor, which takes Star Wars very seriously in contrast with the gee-golly whimsy of the swashbuckling fantasy of A New Hope. Andor pulls it off because it has well-realized characters and a firmly established story with meaningful stakes. Taking Deus Ex super seriously is maybe not what I'm looking for, but it's possible. And unfortunately, Mankind Divided, as well as its predecessor, doesn't quite pull it off. But before we talk about this game's plot, let's talk about what you'll be doing along the way, namely all that running and gunning and stealthing and hacking stuff.
Jensen, still got all your parts together?
Serving as a sequel to Human Revolution, a critically and commercially successful game, and crafted by the same developer, Mankind Divided lifts the vast majority of its gameplay from that game. Remember, Human Revolution wasn't just a prequel to a reputable series of games from a new development team. Publisher Square-Enix was willing to invest big money into making it a hit. It follows then that they would produce a game that was far more approachable to new gamers, especially on consoles, that didn't rely on ever having played Ion Storm's original games. These entries are more action-oriented with solid gunplay and brutal melee takedowns. Stealth is far less ambiguous than the older games, with deliberate snap to cover, chest-high walls, and a very deliberate and informative UI to navigate the environment. Eidos Montreal's Deus Ex games are also very cinematic, justifying their overly written stories with plenty of cutscenes that make clear to the player that they just did something important. Mankind Divided also features plenty of just-find-event level design, which is the tell not show of immersive sims. If you need to access a room or a building for any reason whatsoever and you don't have the means to get through the front door, chances are there's a vent nearby of standard construction that'll get you around it. Often slightly hidden, uncovering them is equal parts reward and contrivance. Mankind Divided doesn't try to fix what isn't broken from Human Revolution that helped make that game a success, but it's also kind of afraid of fixing what is, something that I'll dive into as we talk about the game's big four: combat, stealth, hacking, and social. But first, we have to address your superpowers. Jensen's augmentations are a group of special abilities that are already built into his body, but like downloadable content, they have to be unlocked using in-game currency. In the case of these Montreal games, that currency is Praxis points. Again, you get to experience most of these powers briefly and in hyper-specific scenarios in the opening tutorial, like being able to fall from great distances without taking damage, or punching through weak points in walls to access adjacent rooms. But you spend the rest of the game rebuilding this toolset. This creates some fun inconsistencies over the course of the game, where the cinematics show Jensen using augmentations that I hadn't unlocked yet, or never would. In the older Deus Ex games, you picked up augmentation canisters that forced you to choose between a pair of abilities for each body slot. You had to make a permanent decision about which ability you'd have or not have for the rest of the game, and you couldn't just add it on later. But Eidos Montreal's games decided to flip on that concept. Human Revolution and now Mankind Divided provide you talent trees that constitute all of your possible abilities. You add and upgrade these powers at any time with Praxis, which are distributed for acquiring experience or found in kits around the world. Experience, in turn, is distributed for doing nearly anything in the game, whether taking out enemies, reading stuff, exploring the world, or completing major objectives. You can also just buy Praxis kits if you're sitting on some fat stacks of cash. After you lose all of your tutorial powers in the train station bombing, you meet with your weird underground Aug Doctor to get them fixed. While you're under the knife, he discovers a new set of experimental augmentations that were apparently installed while Jensen was recovering in Alaska between games. Obviously, there's a catch: they're unstable. The game prevents you from enjoying these too much by implementing a new overheat mechanic that, I guess, causes your screen to glitch out or whatever unless you turn off another augmentation to compensate for it. Since I immediately turned off augs that I wasn't interested in while turning on the experimental ones, I never got to truly understand, or I guess appreciate, this mechanic, which the game makes such a big deal about. About 2/3 of the way through this game, you can acquire a MacGuffin that removes the overheating hazard entirely, allowing you to activate as many of these experimental augmentations as you'd like. It's not a great mechanic, honestly. But there's another downside to giving the player unlimited ability to spec their Adam Jensen in any direction they want. That is, it's entirely possible to build your character wrong. This hurts especially when grappling with the game's more open-ended gameplay. The game's many augmentations are split into two broad categories. The first are stats boosts. You increase your health and how much faster it recharges. You improve your hacking abilities to access more difficult caches and unlock more challenging doors, computer terminals, and laptops. The second category includes discrete new abilities that help you access or interpret the world in different ways. One of the best of these augmentations to acquire early on is the ability to lift heavy objects. On its own, being able to pick up big crates and refrigerators might seem inconsequential, but it also allows you to access vents or get rid of heavy things blocking a duct so you can access other areas. It's also a fun thing to toss a fridge at an enemy and all they do is flinch in response, or to repeatedly throw a photocopier at a door to explode it.
What these journalists overlook, however, is the damage these hackers leave in their wake. Last year, the collective shut down London's transit grid, causing gridlock for hours and preventing life-saving medical transports from getting through. In Chile, they committed
The aforementioned detective vision is extremely helpful to the extent that it kind of feels like cheating, and you can install augmentations that allow you to stun enemies or blow them away entirely. But here's the twist. The game doesn't highlight which abilities are in which category, allowing you to easily dump praxis points into things that aren't actually going to help you accomplish your goals or obscure where useful ones are. I would do things on my first playthrough of this game that were really detrimental, like not figuring out how to expand my inventory, which makes playing this game a lot more difficult as you enter the mid-game. Opening up that big blank augmentation menu early on in the game can produce an anxiety around overchoice, since there's little direction on what you can actually accomplish as a character, despite the tutorial, or how often you'll need any ability in particular to accomplish your goals. Yeah, you can add that Typhoon area effect blast, but how often are you really gonna need it as a stealthy character? Or even as a combat-oriented one? This would manifest in other ways too. In my first playthrough, when I couldn't defeat particular challenges using my chosen abilities, I'd have to scrounge the level for more ammo because I would lean on using my guns, whose ammo is limited, rather than play in any other way because it just wasn't effective to do so. Because this is a relatively modern game, the number of enemies that can overwhelm you and how quickly they can do it is ramped up compared to the much older original games, which was more economical about its fights and gave the player plenty of space to retreat to quickly. This forces a lot of save scumming here because you acquire ability A thinking you'd be using it more often than you were, when ability B would have helped a lot better. You'll quickly run out of bioelectricity for what few abilities you do have, and your health meter is short, leaving you fragile when things inevitably turn to combat. Build your character wrong, which this game will absolutely allow you to do, and this sense of treading water will continue all the way until the final encounter. In my original review, I reached the end level and found myself ill-equipped to defeat it. In that video, I talked about the absolute cheesing I had to engage in to defeat the final boss, including taking periodic pot shots from a vent and dialing down the difficulty. For the second run, I loaded up my endgame saves from that run and saw that even though I'd acquired roughly the same amount of experience and therefore praxis points, I had invested in augmentations that were more in line with boosting my stats than adding critical important abilities. One of those, drone domination, allowed me to turn the enemy's armed military drones against him, which helped me immensely this time around. Deus Ex is all about freedom, so it might seem natural that you'd also have the freedom to completely fuck up your progression in a way that wasn't really possible in the older games. Even Human Revolution, which shares so much of this game's DNA. Why? It probably boils down to how Mankind Divided's levels are built, or rather how they're segregated. My theory is that this game's emphasis on a large, intricate hub city that's largely conflict-free invites the player to select specific augs that aren't necessarily the ones you need in the game's more hostile, linear action segments. This disparity isn't apparent in older games, or even really existent, because those games are far more linear with smaller city hubs. Even though Human Revolution and Mankind Divided have the same base augmentations, I didn't feel like I had much in the way to fuck up my character in the older game, because the skills I picked were the ones I used more consistently moment to moment, hour to hour, over the course of the game. Actually, I take that back. There are segments in Human Revolution that did have me reconsider how I doled out praxis points, and those are the game's universally panned boss battles. But considering no one's complaining about building their characters wrong here in Mankind Divided, maybe I'm just spewing hot air. Maybe you had similar difficulties. Let me know in the comments. Since I've already talked about Prague, let's talk about those linear combat sections, which I've affectionately called metal submarines for some reason. They're essentially fenced-in action funnels with a discrete endpoint, whether you're trying to make it to Juan Lebedev's plane in the original game or Talos Rucker's office here. These may be linear segments in a broad sense that there's an end goal or a down and back circuit you need to navigate, but I give Eidos Montreal some big kudos for making these so interesting to navigate, far more so than the endless office levels and grid-like layouts of their previous game. There are plenty of confusing layouts here, intentional or not, whether it's the entirety of Gollum City before or during your adventures in the Throat, or the multi-purpose Apex Center in London, which is theoretically supposed to be friendly to navigate as a public convention space. But confusing levels can be really fun. Mankind Divided's experiments in verticality, like Ark's Barracks module that forces you to work against opponents on multiple levels in an open arena, are equal parts action and puzzle. It's actually fun to get lost in here because it's easy to imagine the learning curve that these unprofessional soldiers faced when they moved in. But how could any of Mankind Divided's levels be authentic without all the tropes of the series or the genre altogether? Throughout the world, you'll find multiple tiers of literature to inform and help you across a spectrum of usefulness. The small, bendy pocket secretaries are perhaps the most vital to pick up because they tend to be the couriers of passcodes and combinations to bypass doors and other coded barriers. They also tend to be extremely important for quest chains. It's like picking up someone's phone, but it only has one message on it. Annoyingly, while you can access all the information you find via these pocket secretaries in your big literature compendium, they're still presented skeuomorphically, as though you're pulling out each individual pocket secretary to read it, rather than just relaying the information itself. Surely this is a betrayal of their desire to have a minimalist interface. Throughout the world and on the stoops of apartments are newspapers. These are updated as you complete quests, especially along the Golden Path, providing a broader scope about what's going on in the world at large. The paper of record is Picus, which faces particular scrutiny in these Montreal games for their monopolistic control of the world's information. They even employ armed mercenaries to maintain that control. The other newspaper is Samizdat, a street paper that is literally underground. They're a little loose on journalistic practices and are kind of just trying to get the information out there, man. They're close to cracking the case on the import-export business that serves as the front for TF-29's super-secret hidden headquarters, but you do some tasks for them so that they make that story disappear. The last time I reviewed this game, I cracked the joke that the editor looked like Hello Games' Sean Murray in hiding after the initial disaster of No Man's Sky. I guess I can't do that again because no one remembers who he is or why he'd be hiding. Ebooks lie around the world for even deeper world building if you're one of those lore junkie weirdos who likes big compendium menus for all this stuff. But there's also lots of other stuff in these levels beyond literature and key codes, like power-ups, ammo, and other utilities. Like any other immersive sim, you'll find yourself scouring room after room, case after case, container after container searching for valuables. Sometimes you'll find rows of lockers to bust through. Some even have locks that require an extra punch to break open. And then there's the ephemeral stuff. There are toilets to flush, loose money to pick up, alcohol to drink, and there is so much liquor in here. You can read pocket secretaries when drunk pretty effectively, which doesn't seem to reflect any reality that I know. Oh look, here's a puzzle you can figure out. And another one! Vents are everywhere, you already know about them. As you resolve any particular objective, you'll uncover other ways to accomplish the same task, whether it's the vent you didn't find, the alternate route you didn't uncover, the way you could have gotten in if you had the specific augmentation to handle a specific environmental hazard. It entices you to consider a second playthrough, and the glittering New Game Plus mode awaits you upon completing the game. One new mechanic that they implemented here is crafting, which was becoming vogue during the development of this game. Amongst this world's many containers and shelves to pilfer, you'll find generic crafting parts that allow you to make consumables like the invaluable multi-tool to bypass hacking minigames or ammo for your AUG weapons. One of the weird experimental AUGs allows you to dismantle inventory items to turn into crafting parts like the recycler from System Shock 2. Somehow, the strange doctors in Alaska felt it would probably be necessary that you be able to break down pistols and rifles and whatever else into stuff that lets you manufacture biocells or whatever. Crafting is a small inclusion here, almost forgettable depending on your playstyle. You made it through Human Revolution without it, and it's not like you're building custom guns or whatever with it, but it does tip their cap towards what was going on with immersive sims at the time. They were slowly disappearing as standalone experiences as their mechanics were being devoured by other larger games. And that brings us to the big four, the core mechanics that allow you to advance the narrative in this game and get things done. For Human Revolution and then Mankind Divided, Eidos Montreal focused on four key areas: combat, stealth, hacking, and social, seemingly in order of importance as far as features go. these aren't truly siloed experiences. You'll inevitably have to mix these mechanics up to accomplish your goals. I mean, if you're resourceful enough, maybe you can gather enough ammo to blast your way through it. If your patience is infinite, there's an achievement for never setting off an alarm, but there's no reward for siding with one mode or another because they aren't discrete and separate. Knowing how to switch lanes when something isn't working is kind of its own reward, because the fun of this game is in its moment-to-moment flexibility. You'll have to face so many unique challenges aided by the game's complex levels, and you'll have so many options for how you can tackle them. But contemporary games required more intense interactions than the sparse-feeling gunplay of the original games, so you'll be forced into more high-tension encounters far more often. This is augmented, pun maybe intended, by the fact that anything short of perfection while being stealthy results in every single enemy combatant in the area swarming in to murder you. So let's break these down. Combat in Mankind Divided, like its predecessor, is solid. The game splits the difference between the wobbling, unskilled reticle of the original game and laser-tight hit scanning of a fast action shooter, and it feels good. Rounds that make contact with your foes leave little graphical X's on their bodies, confirming the hit. It's visually effective. The AI it's okay. When you trip an alarm, they do a good job not beelining directly to your position, but they don't seem to have very good situational awareness. There were a couple of encounters where a train of them would cautiously approach me from an adjacent hallway, and I just picked them off one by one. They just keep filing in to get shellacked until they ran out of combatants within some arbitrary range of the encounter. And you're not stuck with the same vanilla enemies as you progress through the story, nor are you given strange new foes that are much more powerful than you are. As you turn the corner on the augmented rights people, you'll encounter augmented opponents who have similar powers to you, including the ability to cloak or dash around the area. The state police will eventually deploy deadly security robots and drones while taking firm advantage of highly armored exosuits. You'll also have the environment in your favor. You can park against a wall or other solid big thing and shoot from cover, but you can also move along in between chest-high obstacles that give you some maneuverability and some less ambiguous safety. This system is a bit clunky if you're using keyboard and mouse though. I originally played with an Xbox 360 controller and it felt intuitive, but mashing different keys to hop from cover to cover, or over cover, never felt good. As a result, I would occasionally hop out of cover accidentally, which then blew my cover. You'll acquire a spread of weapons in your travels. Some weapons are common among whatever faction you're fighting, so you can rely on a steady stream of ammo for those specific weapons as you mow through their users. You can augment your weapon's abilities with standalone scopes, silencers, and so forth, but you can also use crafting parts to upgrade their stats and abilities too. Despite playing on the harder Give Me Deus Ex mode, I never felt compelled to dive into this upgrade system despite it teasing me anytime I switched ammunition types. I did, however, need to frequently change the kind of ammo I needed for particular encounters against specific enemies. Obviously, EMP rounds are going to work far better against robots than they are human opponents, but I really do wish I didn't need to pull up the entire gun mode menu every time I did it. Maybe there's a button I missed somewhere. Unfortunately, the biggest reason why I was obligated to switch the kind of ammo I was firing was because I was simply out of the ammo I preferred and needed to shoot something at my enemies. So cool, the gunplay is solid, it's fun, it's neato, but the part about Mankind Divided's combat that I repeatedly knocked my head against was the melee, or basically anything to do with your fists in close quarters. In these Montreal games, you don't have an option to just punch stuff. You can't explode a door with your metal arms. You can't just punch someone to death with a single tap. Your melee abilities are delegated to what augmentations you have installed, because simply going around and punching everything with your mechanical tank arms would basically be a cheat code. Against enemies, your fist has power. After sliding into range and deciding whether to knock out an opponent or kill them, the screen cuts to black before revealing a cinematic sequence where you do just that. But this is not you freely swinging a baton or axe, because there are no melee weapons here, unlike the original games. This is a superpower that requires a contextual toggle to use and a recharge before you can do it again. As you can imagine, this gets complicated when you're dealing with multiple opponents in close proximity. This feels like such an artificial limitation. Compounding this, early on, your battery supply to execute this ability has very little charge, meaning you can execute just once before you have to recharge, and it recharges very slowly. I wasted so much time waiting in cover next to an enemy for my energy to recharge just far enough to perform another takedown. If you want to tackle multiple opponents, you either need enough battery capacity to execute 2 takedowns in a row, or you need to acquire that ability further down in the AUG tree. Until then, all you can do as you recharge your battery in close quarters is hide or helplessly wander around them like an idiot without arms. That said, the vast number of melee takedown animations from a variety of attack angles is really cool, whether you're facing them or striking them from cover where Adam conveniently tucks their body away from prying eyes. Unfortunately, they often conclude with Jensen flipping enemies over and punching the ground next to their head, rather than their actual head. These animations can also get pretty tedious, but your mileage will vary. And then there's the environment. You can punch through specific weak points in walls that designers specifically designated to carve an alternate route through a level or access a room you wouldn't otherwise be able to. Unfortunately, these are relatively rare, so if you invest the praxis to unlock this augmentation, it's just gonna sit around collecting dust for the most part. And this is a bit frustrating because there are a lot of objects in this game with damage meters, namely doors, that you can destroy in a variety of ways, like a loud firearm or tossing a photocopier against it. Repeatedly. You know what you can't use to destroy these doors? Your exceptional ability to punch through freaking walls! If you can punch through walls, you should be able to punch through a freaking door. My complaints about melee wouldn't be so sharp if it were a better alternative to gunplay, because the usefulness of gunplay is intentionally limited through the scarcity of ammunition. This philosophy is birthed out of Eidos Montreal's designs for Human Revolution that H. Bomber Guy covered in depth in his review to prevent gamers from simply shooting their way through every situation. And let me be clear, I usually had plenty of ammunition to get my work done because I typically approached every encounter with stealth, casually, and quietly taking out as many enemies as possible without raising the alarm. You can save a lot of ammo this way, but it also came out of necessity. A gun-first approach is really hard to sustain. Grenades and Mankind Divided are cool, maybe one of the first times I thought that using gas or EMP grenades was an effective thing to do. These help when you want to dispatch a larger group of humans than a frag will, or stall robots long enough to bypass them or blow them up by other means. Effective combat requires effective inventory management because your weapons will take up most of your space. I'm glad I found the inventory space upgrades this time around, but swapping weapons in and out and picking favorites is something that you'll need to do regularly. You'll also need to not pick up every single piece of crap you find in the environment because you will quickly run out of space for the things you actually use. You can heal quickly with bottles of painkillers, Max Payne style, that you can find all over the world, but if you need something stronger, you can pull up your inventory menu and use your more powerful stim healing thingies. That same menu will also allow you to dose up with biocells to replenish the electrolytes that your AUGs need. Finally, when it comes to combat, mercifully, boss battles are basically non-existent. Yeah, you fight Marchenko and the Harvester serial killer if you work on that side quest, but you are spared the difficulty and specialty cliffs that those encounters presented in the previous game. Okay, so now we get to talk about stealth. Lifting the stealth gameplay straight out of Human Revolution, sneaking around levels is convenient and intuitive. The vast majority of this is simply staying out of the vision cones of opponents, which obviously becomes more complicated when there are multiple opponents prowling about and at multiple levels above and below you. For the sake of gameplay, guards have to be artificially stupid as to not make stealth gameplay impossible, which is the conceit of any game with stealth gameplay. For starters, entering a hostile zone you're not supposed to be in is thankfully highlighted on your map and signposted by the UI. Knowing that people are looking for you and trying to shred you to bits is a big deal, especially when you're accomplishing sensitive objectives. It seems a little contrived to have hostile areas feature such obvious warnings, and as such a big fan of the original game, I would agree, but the problem is that expectations between older and newer games are very different. In Thief, you could assume that all areas were hostile and plan accordingly. In Deus Ex, levels were split between hubs and metal submarine sections, and so it was clear that you could expect to be on guard. When you started Trouble in Hubs, the dynamic music kicked up and you knew you were in trouble. But the Montreal games feature environments that are far more nuanced and much higher fidelity. Prague is going to have places like backrooms and police stations you shouldn't be in, and maybe you should be alerted to these as a player before you accidentally forfeit some progress over an errant trespass. Wandering around Gollum City, you should know when the ever-present cops are just dystopian set dressing and when they're dystopian agents ready to kill your ass for crossing an invisible boundary. But there's even more to the stealth in this game. Like everyone's favorite Thief game, that 2014 one, detection by baddies is a two-tiered system. When they've caught a glimpse of you, a first-level yellow meter will begin to fill. If you stay out of their vision cone, it'll depreciate and disappear and they'll walk off. If you stay within eyeshot or do something big, loud, and or dumb, that meter will fill up and they go to red alert, at which point they become openly hostile. But this is a little weird because, realistically, a guard should actually ensure that the area is secure when they catch a glimpse of what looks like Neo from the Matrix starting between cover and causing all kinds of weird shadow play. Again, this is good for gameplay, but not as great for realism. I get it's a video game, yada yada yada, but this came to a head when I went to plunder the Palisade Bank in town. Well, the first time I plundered the Palisade Bank in town. Utilizing a thoroughly stealthy approach, the facility became a multi-level graveyard with alarms blaring. Since I'd never been spotted, much less identified, I was able to return to a non-restricted area undetected and watch as every remaining security officer and roving robot searched frantically for a phantom menace that did all the stuff I did while I walked out the front door. I hope they find whoever did it. Versus Human Revolution, guards seem to have more dynamic paths, refusing to stop shy of whatever wall you're crouched behind, a conceit I noticed when I reviewed it a few years back. When you do get into trouble, a ghostly digital representation of you will pop up to indicate your last known location to your enemies, giving you some perspective on where to sneak away from. There are also series-mandated articulating and stationary cameras to catch you when mobile enemies aren't available. You can also blow them up if you don't mind potentially drawing some attention. Naturally, their exaggerated light cones are good gameplay signals to indicate not just where they're looking and what they see, but what level of detection they're at. The game provides plenty of augmentations to better enable stealth gameplay. You can cloak yourself, install quieter legs to not draw attention, see how far your sound attracts opponents on your minimap, hack cameras, laser fences, and mines remotely versus needing to be right on top of them, and so forth. My favorite is the Tesla launcher, a mid-range electric weapon that incapacitates enemies quietly and without killing them. Upgraded, it even allows you to knock out multiple targets at once. The most frustrating part of these as a suite of tools is that so many require deliberate activation and then energy available to be used, which is obviously more frustrating if you haven't upgraded your battery capacities. I don't see why leg silencers should require a toggle to be used. Your legs should just be quieter. If you're playing a purely stealth run and trying to be the foxiest of the hounds, I can understand loading up. But if you don't mind inevitably drawing fire over a careless maneuver and avoiding the safe scum train, stealth gameplay in here is sturdy enough out of the box. Hacking is how you interact with and manipulate the environment to your whims through digital interfaces. It's how you get things to do what they aren't already doing, like open doors, access computers, tell security devices to work for you, or turn them off entirely. If you don't have the password for a particular terminal, you can bypass it with the power of hacking. So how do you hack? Well, it's this singular minigame, actually two, we'll get to that, that's been lifted almost entirely from Human Revolution that you play over and over and over again. I hope you like it, because you'll need to understand its intricacies as you engage with it dozens of times over the course of the campaign. So how does it work? It's a node hopper game. You start at one node and the security program exists at another. You hop from node to node, capturing them until you seize the goal node, or nodes, which give you access to the system. At any point, you may inadvertently trigger the electronic defenses, who then try to trace you back to your starting node. Basically what you're doing, but in reverse. Once they take out your origin node, you fail the hack and the terminal locks you out temporarily. You'll tip off security to your presence, and if you fail a hack enough times, you'll lock yourself out of that terminal entirely. While Human Revolution's version was presented as a flat 2D game board, Mankind Divided switches into 3D with a look that's more stylish, but also harder to read. It can be a bit more difficult to keep track of what's going on at any time, especially as you're getting used to it. With augmentations, you can increase your hacking skills by reducing the odds of setting off the alarm when you capture a node, or more broadly, giving you the ability to hack higher level terminals at all, like important computers or the locks to important doors. There is no separate lockpicking mechanic in this game. Everything is digital. It's all hack, hack, hack. Throughout the world, you'll find one-time use software in the form of giant cartridges, which thankfully makes them easy to spot and so enticing to pick up. These allow you to freeze the security trace program's progress temporarily, reveal a shrouded network to best determine a route through the nodes that you need to capture, or just speed up your efforts altogether. I enjoy this hacking minigame, but even if it becomes tedious, my biggest issue with it is actually the meta. If I can't pull off a hack, I don't know if it's because my skills aren't high enough, which I can control, or because RNG failed me, which I can't. This wouldn't be so irritating if failing a difficult hack didn't potentially kill you, or if the terminal lockout before you can make another attempt wasn't so bloody long. So let's talk about that other, even minier minigame. If you activate the remote hacking AUG, you can disable environmental hazards or turn off alarms at a distance, rather than needing to be within arm's reach, which is incredibly helpful for stealth gameplay. In this mode, you play a timing minigame that goes a lot quicker or requires more zones to hit before your attempt window closes and you fail the hack. This goes a lot quicker, and it's fine, but the experience is a lot more visceral because you don't need to exit the environment entirely to engage it. Of course, what if you want to hack something and you don't actually want to do all the hard work of doing it? Or what if your skill level isn't high enough? Or you just don't like playing that hacking minigame? Enter the multi-tool. You equip it like any gun, point it toward a thing you want to unlock like any gun, and just hold down a button like any gun, and voila! In my experience, they're rare to find in the environment and similarly difficult to find from vendors, so most of the ones I used were ones I had to craft myself. But let's keep this all in perspective. There are rewards for pulling off successful hacks. At the most mundane edge of the spectrum, you get access to emails that are either mission critical or at the very least help fill in some details of the world. You can unlock doors if that photocopier isn't available, and get past security checkpoints without raising alarms. But my favorite part about the hacking trees is your ability to take over security infrastructure. Cameras, turrets, drones, and even the game's bipedal militarized robots can fall under your control if you invest the praxis. My favorite moments in this game involve sneaking to a terminal, hacking it undetected, and unleashing a security force's own deadly robots against them. Finally, at the very end of the line, is social. In previous immersive sim breakdowns, I called it dialogue, but it's the part where you talk to people to achieve a result. In GDC presentations, Deus Montreal explains that this was definitely their least important gameplay to implement, and honestly, you can tell. It's kind of a bummer considering how much talking you'll do in this game. I have big problems with Mankind Divided's writing and story, but if I set aside matters of style and taste, compared to the original game, you seem to have less sway on the world via dialogue than ever in this series. Conversing with NPCs in those older games seemed to go much further toward changing what happens next, or even what story notes and side quests will or won't occur, or how they resolve. But here in Mankind Divided, conversations are shockingly linear in both construction and result. It doesn't feel like you're using conversation to shape the world, or even having a conversation at all. It feels like you're chatting with people merely to get through the conversation and receive whatever information they're designed to deliver. And that's it. This is not a system that even rises to the ambition of say this to achieve a specific result, much less you have this augmentation reference this to get another outcome. It's just, here's the conversation and the slight twists that get you to the same result, the most powerful probably being whether to accept a quest or not. And then there's the Casey Persuasion module, which is supposed to be the special sauce of this game's social mechanics. So what is it? Well, It's a flimsy minigame where a target's dialogue arbitrarily flares with different personality notes, and it's your job, like a really boring version of Simon, to give a response that matches those notes. If you're successful, you can persuade a target to not do whatever thing they're doing, or do the thing they should be doing, whatever the case may be. If you can get over the plausibility gap of being able to very quickly persuade someone of strong convictions in the course of a conversation, even a successful result is overshadowed by how uninteresting and insultingly simple this mechanic is, and how rarely it's used at all. There are only 8 of these sequences in the entire game. Maybe the most interesting part of the system is when characters can defy it. The Pied Piper techno-hypnotist casts an area effects spell on you that renders any of your choices useless. Late in the game, the grizzled detective Montag calls you out for using it, much like Malik did in Human Revolution, and it just deactivates. None of this paints Eidos Montreal's work on the dialogue system in a flattering light, so where did they actually pull a win here? If you've been a fan of this channel for very long, you know that I cannot stand lore dumps, and Obsidian is terrible about this. I played The Outer Worlds a few years back and had issues with it there, but I recently played Avowed, and from the very first conversation, I was getting flummoxed by conversations about the 5th king in the 19th era who created the Big Plague in the regions of blah blah blah. And look, I'm glad backstory exists, world building is dope, but I definitely don't need to shovel my way through dialogue that's larded with it. This game's ebooks, I flip through them to get the experience points and then page out. And so it goes that I really enjoy Mankind Divided's ability to just get you through these conversations if they're not going to give you any meaningful agency. I call this their T system because dialogue options are placed in a T on the dialogue selection wheel. If you want more information about a particular event, person, or place that someone's talking about, you can select it on the left or right, and sometimes up direction. If you just want to move on, you select the down option and move on to the next actionable segment. I love it not just because it works, but because it's unambiguous. I don't want to go through the process of weighing my next dialogue decision and still get a lore dump no matter what. Many years ago, Deus Ex creator Warren Spector pitched the idea of One City Block, an RPG that would take place in a dense, hyper-connected urban space with all the homes, businesses, and hundreds of people who live there. It would be an intricate simulation of all these different entities and how they interact that wouldn't focus on blasting your way through a tunnel to reach an end goal. Modern games like Disco Elysium and Shadows of Thush tackle this concept in different ways and accomplish some interesting results, even if it's not quite what most people would envision from such a pitch. Hopefully something closer to that concept can transcend the mundanity or the tedium of having 100 similar apartments in a building, or whatever. I mention this all to say that Mankind Divided takes a swing at the concept too. This is basically a city block RPG, but due to the design of the world and a lot of lost time to bad creative decisions, it doesn't ever feel like it takes advantage of the space. The level design is intricate, yes, but few of Prague's disparate elements ever feel like they work together. They're just there. You take the Prague setting and the Mankind Divided ImSim gameplay, and you really just kind of have a space that you run through to reach the next mission objective. Everything in between feels regimented at best and inconsequential at worst, like running past rows of advertisements of various usefulness, which is, well, it's literally what a lot of Prague is. In a way, this game feels like it has more in common with Cyberpunk 2077's very urban, immersive sim experiments than it does with the original game. Cyberpunk's situational puzzles and missions were hyper-localized to whatever bar or club or warehouse you were engaged in and didn't spill beyond it. They felt intimate, but they also felt small and locked off. This is true of Mankind Divided as well, but my expectations for either were very different. This is all to say that the tiny vignettes of Mankind Divided don't inspire awe or fill my imagination in the way that the virtually large spaces of Hell's Kitchen, Hong Kong, or Vandenberg did in the original game. Hell, even the sub-pen in that game is an ImSim theme park compared to the endless vent crawling and hallway navigating of this game. It also doesn't feel like there are nearly as many opportunities to experiment gameplay-wise or through the level design like Warren Spector once crooned about in reaction to playtests from the original game. It feels like the solution to any problem is pretty well defined and telegraphed, tied to having particular augmentations. As a result, improvisation doesn't seem very possible despite the game having access to far more power and technology to enable it. Here's an example of what I mean. In trying to access the locked chamber of that techno-hypnotist very early on in the game, he manages to disable your weapons, so your choices are kind of limited as far as how you can tackle the situation. I could have just waited until I had more AUGs to hack open a back pipeway to access his chamber directly, bypassing his series of military turrets. Or I could have waited until I had better hacking skills and dealt with the turrets directly. But what happens when you don't have all those powers like I didn't? If I try and hack the front door of the techno-hypnotist chamber, I can't hack it fast enough before I fall into the view shed of the high-powered turret nearby. So how did I get in? Well, I wound up stacking some barrels haphazardly next to a crate so that the turret wouldn't see me while I hacked the door. It's the only example of this kind of improvisation that I can remember from this playthrough. Everything else felt like I was executing a pre-programmed maneuver, a choice based on something that designers had decided years ago. And look, I want to be very clear, this is a fun game. On its own, it would be one of the best ever, maybe even carrying a cultish reputation like 2017's Prey does. But whether it's Eidos Montreal streamlining gameplay to appeal to more casual gamers, or the expense of developing a high-fidelity open world, or whatever else, as solid as Mankind Divided is, it's saddled with the baggage of being a Deus Ex game. Unfortunately, it doesn't quite fulfill that potential in terms of moment-to-moment gameplay or mission-by-mission level design. But as you already know, what really lets Mankind Divided down for everyone is the story. So let's investigate why it fails to steer this game towards greatness.
Relax, Soko. If Interpol needs to learn the same lesson we taught the police, we will be glad to teach them. We will go to any lengths to protect Alice. Now go. Go keep your eyes open, and we will handle Interpol together.
Like Human Revolution, Mankind Divided suffers from having too much meaningless story. It seems that Eidos Montreal felt obligated to make their corner of the universe feel dense and lively compared to the bare-bones narrative structure of the original game. But this story, these characters, and these side quests all together just feels like a bunch of foam filler. Even the firm structural elements that are supposed to keep this entire narrative tent in the air seem hollow. The best first example of this is in the game's recap of Eidos Montreal's previous title, which I've already ranted about for how exhaustive it is in its endless recounting of minor details. The best second example is this Pepe Sylvia-esque digital corkboard in Task Force 29's offices, revealing an ocean of different organizations and their associated personnel. Mankind Divided tries to address nearly all of them at once in a broader attempt to, again, backfill the game's narrative volume, but also highlight how many different entities the Illuminati manipulate to their own selfish ends. On this board are gangsters and freedom fighters alike, but as a tease, it also includes the Northwest Secessionist Forces, an undisciplined American militia that becomes your first opponent in the original game. As you cross paths with these different groups, the board will mark off the people you snuff out and add other notes, but it doesn't ever feel like a genuine progress meter when most of this stuff has little weight assigned to it, even if it is in the game. Pre-Montreal, Deus Ex games navigated these bigger casts and closets full of organizations by being more linear in structure, revealing them in order of importance and influence with a helpful overlap that doesn't overwhelm, a bit like revealing a nesting doll layer by layer. Here, none of these orgs really feel important to what's going on, except the Augmented Rights Coalition, or ARC, which serves as the actual backbone of this story. ARC is an organization that seems equal parts advocate for the augmented, who are clearly suffering in this world, but also a cult of personality around leader Talos Rucker. A medical doctor who becomes augmented after an injury in the field, Rucker becomes a powerful activist, a position that becomes even more important following the AUG incident. From the game's earliest moments, you see his ideal, hopeful, and glowing visage in propaganda posters. You even get to visit the print shop where they're produced. But in brief glimpses, and eventually in person, you see that the stress has cracked him into a sweaty, stressed out mess. Rucker becomes a hero for millions, even appearing on Picus to argue for augmented rights, but that also makes him a target. Jensen's boss, Director Miller, explains without any evidence that Rucker is responsible for the train station bombing. We discover later on that even Miller doesn't believe this. He's just passing off orders from his boss, Joseph Manderley, who's an agent of the Illuminati under Bob Page.
We've got a problem. Miller wants to see a report on the break-in.
What break-in?
The one your San Francisco research facility is supposed to have any day now.
What? What exactly did you tell him? Never mind. I'll take care of it.
The actual forensic investigation of the train station bombing becomes its own quest line, but it's not terribly interesting, and it barely supports the game's weak conclusion. We'll talk about that later. Halfway through Mankind Divided, you're sent to arrest Rucker, a task that involves infiltrating the Throat inside Golem City, which is where ARC has set up a base and brought Rucker in. Golem City, known more formally as the Utilec Complex, was once built to house augmented workers outside of Prague, so it has effectively always served as a ghetto. After the Aug incident, it devolved into an unmaintained, interconnected series of dark, confusing structures, not unlike Kowloon City. Golem City is perhaps the most beautiful setting in the game, and not just graphically. The game works hard to paint how much despair exists in its ugly, contorted hallways, with exposed piping and haphazardly laid out infrastructure. When you arrive, state police have flooded the place searching for Rucker as well. So now we have to talk about the Santo Group and Nathaniel Brown, who only gets some lip service before the very end of the game. As it actually happened, the Illuminati had the Ruzicka train station bombed so that people, whether unaltered or augmented, would rise up against Rucker and ARC. This would also help boost support for the Human Rights Restoration Act within the United Nations that would limit the rights and capabilities of the augmented at a global legislative level. The Illuminati wants this because augmentations give people too much power. As a plurality, the augmented pose a threat to their power. They can't be giving the proletariat any kind of bargaining power, okay? Fortunately for the augmented, billionaire Nathaniel Brown combats the Illuminati's shadowy influence with his own outsized capitalist powers. Throughout the game, you'll see sunny advertisements for Rabia, Brown's next big project for the augmented, out in the Arabian desert that hinges on the Human Rights Restoration Act not passing. Brown is a new face to this series, but Human Revolution players will be familiar with his work. His Santo Group was responsible for Panchaea, the giant hole in the ocean that serves as the concluding level for that game. Brown is really into massive construction projects, and it really does seem that he has a heart for the augmented, since Golem City was a Santo project as well. But man, wouldn't it have been great if Brown had been a more fleshed out, complex character that is actively building projects for the augmented, while only really being interested in the profit? How much more interesting and realistic would it have been if you were fighting for the right ends but using the wrong means? Besides, an altruistic billionaire is a bit contradictory. It's also a bit of a sin that this game doesn't play up the fact that Golem City was originally advertised as a sunny and safe place for the augmented to live, free from persecution, but when you arrive, it's become a hellhole for desperate people. It would have been nice if the game had played up and educated the player on this and Rabia as world-changing projects, but it spends so much of its narrative energy chasing squirrels in Prague. Within ARC's base, which houses not just their propaganda factory and production offices, but the barracks I mentioned earlier, you meet walking tank Viktor Marchenko. He's clearly a relative of Gunther Hermann from the original game, both bulked up with augmentations designed to rip, tear, and blow shit up. Jensen's initial confrontation with him, the first of only 3, is vaguely terrifying. Marchenko reveres the peaceful Rucker, or at least pays lip service to him, because it's apparent very quickly that he believes in the value of violence for the cause, whatever that is to him. If you tap into his emails, it's clear he's up to no good. Rucker has evidence about something nefarious going on under his nose if you manage to talk it out of him. You eventually discover that Marchenko is the captain of the Illuminati sleeper cell, the one with the dudes with the gold masks in the tutorial, that was responsible for the train station bombing under Bob Page's guidance.
Page, activate the sleep cell.
9 years ago, my original run through ARC Space had me hopelessly lost, so playing it again wasn't just easier, I also had far less of an issue finding the final elevator because the waypoint arrow wasn't bugged this time. You meet the isolated and alcoholic ARC leader alone. Rucker is clearly cracking under the stress of being the head of this massive resistance organization. Now he's at the end of a pointed effort to find him and bring him into custody. How he's able to stand there and report to Jensen so stoically without much of a hint to his internal turmoil seems like a lost opportunity. There's no fear in this dude, despite his poor shape and disposition. He just reports what he knows. Before he can turn himself in, he reveals that his underlings are dealing with something called Orchid, a terrible substance that kills augmented people. Orchid is the technological predecessor to the Grey Death, a manufactured plague that spreads before the events of the original game, allowing the Illuminati to control society through the artificial scarcity of its vaccine, Ambrosia. The knife twist in all of this is that Dr. Megan Reed, Jensen's ex, is revealed to have a part in architecting it. How does she not know the damage this thing will cause? When Jensen learns about this later on, he almost becomes emotional about it. Thwip! A switch flips within Rucker as he's taking another sip of his whiskey, and his augmentations go haywire, killing him violently. This is the game's way of letting you know that Orchid is some serious bad business. You don't so much as leave Golem City at this point as you escape it. As ARC soldiers squeeze off rounds at you as you leap into Chicane's plane, Marchenko emerges wordlessly to telegraph that he is the big bad now. He is the threat behind Orchid. He's the militiaman behind the train station bombing. ARC now appears to be without a leader, but the game doesn't cast Marchenko into that role, nor is it interested in exploring this. Now that Rucker is dead, ARC can now also be tossed into a narrative closet. You return to Prague without Rucker and have to investigate this Orchid thing. Miller really wanted you to return with Rucker, and you feel the tension as Jensen has to convince his boss that there's some bigger stuff going on. Namely, Rucker wasn't the villain behind the train station bombing, but Miller already knows that. He cuts you some slack because, and he doesn't say this outright, but he'd like some proof that Rucker wasn't involved too. And so you keep investigating. For a game that's built on uncovering evidence and solving crimes, it's kind of amazing how little detective-esque gameplay and mechanics there are. You kind of just fight or stealth your way to each new revelation, and everyone else flies in the details. You're also tasked by Alex to infiltrate Miller's virtual conversations with his bosses, hoping to confirm his connection to the Illuminati. You break into his apartment to acquire the key card to access his neural interface, which, as Miller's virtual avatar, puts you virtually face-to-face with Miller's boss Joseph Manderley and Manderley's boss Bob Page, key figures in the original game. I'll talk more about the virtual stuff later. These revelations finally allow you to meet with Janus, which is the game periodically reminding you that the Juggernaut Collective is a thing that matters. Janus tells Jensen that Bob Page is an evil dude, but the player already knows this. They also reveal that Page runs VersaLife, which is something that Jensen could have looked up in a Fortune magazine, but if you've played the original game, you already know this too. The feed with Janus cuts out right as you're tasked with accessing VersaLife's vault deep within the Palisade Bank for more concrete evidence that both Jensen and Janus both need to tie all this Orchid stuff together. And this is the only time that the game presents the player with a choice to affect the narrative in any meaningful way by forking the golden path in twain. Down one path, you have to figure out what's going on with the train station bombing for TF-29 by tracking down a watchmaker whose work was found at the bomb site. On the other hand, you have to figure out what's tying VersaLife and Bob Page to this Orchid thing. In either case, someone involved with the other mission will nag you that you didn't pursue their task as a consequence of your action.
You're not going to the bank, are you?
Like I said, the bomb maker.
Can tell us everything, I know. But we're talking about a bioweapon, Adam. Once that vault is cleared out, whatever information was stored on the Orchid will be wiped clean. Gone.
Where are you, Mr. Jensen? You said you were coming.
I got caught up in something. I'll be there soon, Mr. Stanek.
There is no more soon. You are too late. My little girl is gone. She's gone to their ascension.
In my first playthrough, I went after the watchmaker whose daughter, Allison, is a traumatized soldier and bomb maker who is now also the head of a mechanical transcendence cult. It's sheer coincidence that you confront her mere moments before their transcendence ceremony, where people are about to yeet their augmented brains into a big computer. This branch wraps with Allison pointing you to the GARM facility in the Swiss Alps, where Marchenko and his gold-masked sleeper cell hole up. Unfortunately, Prague's Church of the Machine God is such an underdeveloped non-entity in this game, despite how well their escapades fit into the game thematically. Yes, their cultists have a post in your apartment complex, but it's easy to brush over them and then not run into them ever again unless you elect to chase down Allison. It's equally sad and hilarious that the International Church thinks Allison is out of line for doing what she's about to do here. Just as absurd is that you're able to change her mind entirely with just a few button presses within the game's flimsy persuasion minigame here. This time around I went down the other branch and returned to Palisade, well after I'd cleared out the top floors in my previous adventures here. After encoding a blank digital key from Janice, I got to access the storage vaults deep within the bank. There I found information about Orchid, which tied back to Bob Page, and a new facility owned by VersaLife called GARM. Shock, surprise, indeed. This segment is only slightly more interesting than frustrating because even as you go to different places, talk to different people with different motivations, you still wind up with the same information and become tasked with the exact same mission afterward. The only real change in outcome comes at the tail end of the game if you went to the VersaLife vault, because it contains an Orchid antidote enzyme thingy, which you can use in the final level to save Miller's life, or the delegates if they've ingested their Orchid spiked champagne. Oh, by the way, Orchid is super bad for non-augmented people too. Really, my frustration lies in the fact that this is the only drastic grade of narrative decision making in the whole game, or in either Eidos Montreal game, when the older games regularly called on you to make choices that affected the story beyond the conclusion of your current quest. The GARM facility high in the snowy Swiss Alps is an interesting distraction. Convincing Miller to act quickly means going without backup. MacReady is busy, sitting in his office continuing to investigate Dubai and all that, which feels like 2 or 3 games ago at this point. With the clock ticking, Miller tasks Jensen with performing reconnaissance on the GARM site, and no more. You land in a canyon near GARM, and just as you're about to enter the back door, you're surprised by Merchenko, who then stabs you with a dose of Orchid. Shock surprise yet again, this does nothing because Jensen can't be killed by it. You wake up the next day and have to battle your way through this place, which is really just the warehouse, workshop part of the facility, not the cool looking part you get a glimpse of just before you depart. GARM is really just a metal submarine level with a puzzle and some story-related emails sprinkled in. It's not a mind-blowing segment in the slightest. In fact, it almost feels like a filler level. There's basically nothing that happens story-wise during your 45 minutes to an hour here before you retreat to Prague. Still, battling Marchenko's gold-masked weirdos in an extremely bright, snowy area with a beautiful tunnel chiseled out of ice is a nice change of scenery. You return to Prague at night in the pouring rain, which is now a city under martial law. While you were out being killed in the mountains, riots were happening in Prague in response to the death of Rucker. That this happens entirely off-screen, perhaps the most interesting thing to happen in Prague in the game, is supremely disappointing. The state police enforce martial law violently, gunning down anyone they see out on the streets, with all the militarized robots and exosuits they can summon.
Let's see what we have. Fuck! Then why did he run?
What's the holdup? So
we killed a citizen.
The city's on lockdown. A true citizen would respect that.
Civilians who don't desire to be shot at by the cops are holed up in their apartments or in the clubs. Other important characters, including those you may have helped in side quests along the way, find safety in the sewers. Prague has now become a hostile scenario where you have to avoid everyone, a big wide metal submarine level. At a top level, the Juggernaut Collective is interested in synthesizing a cure for the Orchid, while everyone at TF-29 is curious about your safety. Miller feuds with the state to get them to withdraw their curfew so TF-29 agents like you can move around without being murdered.
When? Don't give me that crap. I need safe passage around this city. Yes, that's what I'm trying to tell you. The city's in lockdown, I get it, but...
You now know that Marchenko is the big bad dude here, and he has this really awful chemical that will kill lots of people. So now what? You're tasked with infiltrating the Diwali's turf on the east end of Prague, a section that had previously been inaccessible for information about Marchenko. Why are you going after the Diwali? Well, in the time between playing the game and writing this review, I had completely forgotten. The connection is made primarily through a brief conversation with Miller, where Jensen conveniently remembers a throwaway line Marchenko says while they're dragging out your body to the GARM dumpster.
I heard Marchenko talking to his men. He said something about finalizing a deal with the Diwali.
So much of the game's big pivots come this way, through brief, unemotional exposition. Since it'll definitely take too long to get approval from state police to let you just wander right in, Jensen is tasked yet again with a solo infiltration without backup. I know it's a Deus Ex tradition to operate alone with your coworkers waiting in the wings to clean up afterward, but I don't know, the rationales for why he has to do it are pretty thin in this game. And look, the Diwali turf is neat. Their theater is dope. It's stylish, it's fun to wander around here, the bathrooms are dope. I don't know how the Diwali boss died. I think I just murdered him really quick accidentally, like his subordinate Otis. I really feel like I missed out on a lot of Diwali content because they just opened fire on me whenever I wound up in their offices. On the Diwali boss's computer, you uncover not just proof of the Marchenko-Diwali connection and their dealings together, but Marchenko is doing something nefarious in London where Nathaniel Brown is throwing a party to sway UN delegates to vote against the Illuminati's big bullshit bill. So now it's time to hop across the continent to stop Marchenko for good. London in Mankind Divided is presented in a way that reveals nothing particularly special or unique about London, unlike Prague. I'm not saying the final confrontation needed to happen within the gears of Big Ben, however cool that would have been, but your time here is locked down exclusively to a futuristic civic center flanked by DNA-shaped future structures that could genuinely exist anywhere on the planet. You meet Brown up front, but make your way down to his party under the guise of casing the place. You discover that the security detail, provided by the feebly generic security company Tarvos, has already been infiltrated by Marchenko's men. Apparently, he has a small army here considering how many of his people you have to engage with. After taking out a chunk of them and finally arriving at the party, you have to prevent the partiers from freaking out about the situation by knocking out all of Marchenko's guards who are patrolling amongst the crowd with the utmost discretion. You'll also want to acquire the catering key from one of them because that's where they've established another strong presence in the building. You knock out these dozen-ish guards with some mandatory stealth, and in the back of house you discover that the booze that's circulating throughout the party has been poisoned with orchid, prompting some don't drink the champagne urgency. Oh, and Miller's been left for dead. It seems like he dies, but I swear I got the cure for the orchid so that he doesn't die. I don't know. Maybe the third game would have been entirely about Miller recuperating in a hospital bed. Who knows? Jensen reaches Brown's actual private party, where the real people are getting stuff done, and convinces them to not drink the wine, if you're on time. There's a lot of time-sensitive objectives in this final level of the game, which makes sense considering there's been so little tension in the story up to this point. At the same time, Marchenko feels the need to arbitrarily blow up something, namely the nearby residential towers, so you need to rush down to him before he levels them. I don't know, all these years later and I'm still impressed by his triggering device. It's just so cool. You reach the arena where he's just hanging out alone for dramatic purposes, and you have to kill him. And so you do, however you can. The game concludes back in Prague with Adam telling Alex he wants to pursue the Illuminati and their plans, but also definitely Janice, who he still believes is a literal person that he can meet in person. The lines come out of his mouth as though every gamer isn't throwing tomatoes at their TV or computer monitor, frustrated that they know more about the situation than Jensen does. What follows is a Picus news feed that serves as a modular outro, not terribly dissimilar to what they do in Obsidian games with all the extended conclusions of the quests you completed along the way. It would have been nice if it had been a bit more thorough, considering I deliberately made an attempt to complete as much in the game as possible, but that might be hard from the perspective of an international Picus news broadcast. And that's the end of the franchise. It's done and over. Skip ahead 25 years and you're playing the original game. That's it. Or is it? Have you ever just written a bunch of bullshit to get a story across the finish line? I mean, yes, I am speaking from experience. In my original review, I asked why Meki Marchenko would be so interested in working against his best interests. He was a lieutenant to Rucker who believed in a pacifist approach to AUG rights. If you do some extra research in the game, it's clear he has a very unexplainable past with big gaps in his history. Here is this mysterious dude with questionable motivations that you defeat for a questionably dramatic conclusion. Marchenko was just about to blow up a series of residential buildings and cause thousands of civilian deaths. And to what end? In preparing for this review, I revisited the trailers and the teaser trailers for this game, which were obviously part of an orchestrated campaign to hint at what action you'd get into and why it'd be important. These trailers tease a much grander, dramatic conflict where Adam must weave between both sides with much more consequence and action, presumably Task Force 29 and the Juggernaut Collective, and that's not what happens here. The shipping game's investment in Marchenko ahead of your climactic confrontation with him is minimal and fleeting at best. He's a minor character here. In the pre-release trailers, Marchenko took a leading position. In the shipping game, his presence and position are demoted in favor of Rucker, a pacifistic and troubled figure. It's to my understanding that the story they originally wrote featured Marchenko taking a more in-front militant role after the death of Rucker on the premise that the augmented embracing pacifism clearly didn't work, and they must now use violence to achieve their means. This is largely speculation, but holy shit is it so much more interesting to think about than what they eventually settled on. In fact, when the narrative branches that one time, if you decide to take on the bank job instead of tracking down Allison, you'll miss her sympathetic pleas to show Marchenko mercy as though he deserves it, or has ever earned it. Her request feels like a line written for a previous version of the game where he had a much bigger role with a character foundation that was far more established. Where did that game go? In my review for Human Revolution, Jensen's actor, Elias Toufexis, explained that there were some large changes in the narrative because what they had wasn't working. It was boring. Alex was there, so was Orchid, but that's all he can remember in his brief Reddit AMA reply here. And so they overhauled it. Apparently, he got to provide a lot of critical feedback about the story that other actors weren't invited to give. So now we get Eidos Montreal's solution, a story that feels lumpy with very few consequences to your actions and little connection to what's going on. It feels like you're in the second or third season of a CBS cop procedural with a plot that resembles that kind of show's problem of the week format. I mean, look, one of the biggest reasons why I bought into this franchise in the first place when I was just a squeaky-voiced 16-year-old Best Buy employee was printed on the box of the original game. Severe consequences. Choices you made in that game changed the course of the story. And even though that was largely smoke and mirrors back then, Eidos Montreal doesn't know how to take advantage of it here or in their previous game, crafting an overly written narrative that cares little for what the player wants to accomplish and more about sniffing its own farts, which it must think are super succulent. Despite how much story is in here, there are very few highlights. It just hums along. It just keeps going. There are no great character moments. Adam doesn't grow as a protagonist despite literally everything requiring his involvement. There are no grand revelations. There's little feeling of traction or progress. You stop the equivalent of 9/11 in London by augmented terrorists, but since this is revealed in the waning hours of the game, it doesn't feel consequential in the slightest, not helped by the fact that there's so little setup or motivation for it by the actors. The narrative filler between each major story event, like when you're dawdling around in Prague, feels inconsequential. Dealing with the Diwali feels inconsequential. Little of it feels like you're accomplishing anything except to set up more reasons to earn experience and activate more of your augmentations. And this makes so much sense as every account of how this story came together depicts some level of tortured conjuration. It's no wonder that this story feels like shards of glass in a blender. So I return to the question I asked in the conclusion of my Human Revolution review. Did we really want the third part of this trilogy if it was going to be so difficult to tie together and not not mean much when they did? Did we really want whatever this act of Jensen's arc was to follow if it wasn't planned and everything in the story barely came together at all? If you squint your eyes, it's easy to see how this was the middle chapter of an inevitable Jensen trilogy. But if you unsqueeze those lids even slightly, give Mankind Divided's story even the slightest amount of evaluation, it's clear that all of this was being made up as Square-Enix pressured them to get this game out the door after half a decade in development. How poorly Mankind Divided came together as a story after Human Revolution's convoluted and unsatisfying introduction truly makes the pleading moans of the deprived fanbase screeching for a third Jensen game seem so futile. The brightest glimmer of hope I can see from a third Jensen game comes not from what you spend a few dozen hours wading through in the base game, but what they managed to fit together for this game's very uneven expansion content.
I wouldn't move right now if I were you.
For this review, I got to experience a whole bunch of content for Mankind Divided that I'd never played before. You have to understand, like every other clout-chasing creator on here, I rushed my original review out the door as quickly as possible in hopes of capturing some views by starting my playthrough the moment it unlocked on Steam. It didn't matter in the slightest because no one watched it, but here we are. Mankind Divided's trio of standalone single-player content capsules, Desperate Measures, System Rift, and A Criminal Past work alongside and augment the campaign, but they don't weave directly into it like expansion content for modern games do. Instead, you access them via a separate menu, as if you're switching discs entirely to play them. For emphasis, these modules exist entirely independently of your progress in the main game, and they don't tie into your save file progress either. As you begin each episode, you'll have to build up an entirely new inventory and activate an entirely new set of augmentations, thankfully with a bank of praxis points to get you started. In particular, this can make augmentation choices so much harder because you have so little time with each individual expansion to flesh out what you want your Jensen to be able to do. That anxiety is slightly heightened because a lot of this content is Metal Submarine stuff, where the need to exercise your abilities is more specific and important. Hopefully, you made the right choices. But my favorite part of these episodes is that they bring some fresh and interesting ideas to the table. Jensen as a character feels more slack and realistic, rather than uptight and no-nonsense. That's the advantage of Eidos Montreal having already built a stable base and environment to work from, so they could focus on making the story shine as much as possible. Playing these, I had flashbacks to the story expansions for The Outer Worlds, which featured the best scenarios and settings in the entire game. You can go watch my review for that, too! Desperate Measures is an extremely brief Metal Submarine level where you're dropped outside the headquarters of Tarvos Security that's currently being renovated, and you have to make your way inside. TF-29 received a tip that the footage they received indicating ARC as the perpetrators of the train station bombing was modified by Tarvos. You have to figure out why, and the head dude in charge should probably know that. At roughly an hour long, this feels like a chopped out side quest, which makes sense considering it was a pre-order bonus they eventually made free for everyone. As far as Deus Ex infiltrations go, this isn't particularly outstanding. There's a generic maintenance area, then a generic warehouse area, then a generic office/data center area with vents tying them all together. Then you have to double back through it all once you've handled the station supervisor. There are no new interesting mechanics, characters, or assets in here. Not helping anything is that this DLC spends over 8 minutes story dumping before you can even begin to interact with it. So why did Tarvos modify the train station security footage? I don't even want to spoil it because it's so inconsequential to anything that happens in the overarching story. Desperate Measures goes so far as to provide multiple endings based on how you handled your opponents inside Tarvos, but they amount to little more than Peter Chang's facial reactions in the very final seconds of this expansion. As soon as the game very slowly fades to black, the consequences of your choices here are sealed away inside the DLC itself. Desperate Measures set my expectations pretty low, but System Rift, which came out a month after launch, brought it back up. Yes, it's a zipped up baggie of content divorced from the main story, but it more than makes up for it by taking firm advantage of its runtime. The opening is extremely cinematic. Jensen lounges in his apartment watching a baseball game, which seems firmly out of character for him. No. Jensen is supposed to be a man on a mission, 24/7, forever stoic. Forever. Anyway, his downtime is interrupted when Frank Pritchard injects himself into Jensen's TV feed, recruiting him for a corporate infiltration job because Jensen owes him one for something that happened in the 2 years we don't talk about between games. So who's the target? It's Palisade Bank, like the actual Blade building that floats over the river. Ooh, that's compelling. In order to get in, you'll have to read a Palisade employee who's an anti-AUG asshole, and Shadowchild, the hacker who will take Shaw's key and modify it for you. You don't get to spend a whole lot of time with it, but System Rift introduces a new slice of Prague. It's exciting. It's exciting not just because it's fresh and new after you've been tooling around Prague's primary zones for hours, but because you get to see how severe anti-AUG sentiments in this universe can be. Prejudice in the rest of Mankind Divided is largely fangless, which is ironic considering this whole damn game is based on a forceful mechanical apartheid, a cleaving of the augmented from civilization. The people being assholes to you for being augmented should do more than just waste your time as they blast generic clanker rhetoric. Here, reaching Dosh involves accessing an anti-AUG bar down in a hostile alley that gives really uncomfortable supremacy vibes. In the context of this game and its thematic ambitions, it's actually a bit of a relief to see such deliberately bigoted and hateful people. After meeting with Shadowchild, a Palisade widow reaches out to Jensen to uncover some clues about their spouse's murder being covered up by the company. I didn't get to finish this quest line for reasons we'll get into in a second, but it's cool that this content offers a second quest to accomplish while you're infiltrating the Blade. Once you find your way into the Blade, you'll wish you could have done more stuff out in the new Prague chunk, because this DLC quickly becomes another metal submarine death trap to work through. It's a bit like the Desperate Measures episode, but a bit more ambitious. There are lots of vents to crawl through, cubicles to sneak around, stealth takedown opportunities, and a metric fuck ton of staying out of camera vision cones. What's odd to me is that the innards of this deeply angular and then cantilevered blade is that they don't seem to match the exterior in size or layout. Here it seems narrower, deeper, and shorter than the proportions presented outside or in cutscenes for, I guess, the sake of gameplay and level design. Once you reach the plank portion of the building, your ability to maneuver becomes very restricted. It becomes perhaps the most intensely Metal Submarine-esque it does in the entire game. Your patience and reflexes will be tested as you dodge multiple layers of cameras, mechs, and other security devices as you sneak around these data vaults. After being trapped inside, you encounter another neural interface to gain access to this game's virtual world to access the data you need to steal for Pritchard. The virtual sections are pretty, but how do you feel about invisible platforming that you need to utilize your detective vision for? There are some simple puzzles here that will make you pine for a new Portal game because they're merely okay here. You also get the opportunity to work alongside Pritchard's virtual avatar and escape the virtual space with the data you need. Outside the neural interface, you now have to escape the physical blade, which is now in full alert thanks to your antics. If you didn't care much about getting into the data fortress, you'll find getting out is even less thrilling. Thankfully, you can just drop out of a hole in the floor into the river below. I wasn't a Pritchard fan, much less a stan in Human Revolution, but as a far more sympathetic character here, I actually kind of enjoyed his presence. That's not something I can say about basically any of the characters in these Montreal games. And just as I felt that warm ping against my cold, cynical heart, the DLC ended. What's so interesting about this DLC is that the story sets up the standalone Breach game, but it didn't arrive until a month after the base game was released with Breach in tow. It seems odd that you'd need to complete this additional piece of content to understand what's going on in Breach, despite Breach having its own introductory cutscene that's clearly missing some context. So what's going on? Well, the data cache that you stole with Pritchard reveals that Palisade has been mining their customers' data, particularly their most important and connected clients, and making money off of that data. With that knowledge, Shadowchild, again, a character you wouldn't really have an introduction to unless you played this content, has reached out to light, medium, and dark webs to summon a flood of hackers to breach, get it, Palisade servers for justice and all that. We'll come back to Breach in a bit. Coming off Desperate Measures, this DLC is such a relief. No, I don't care that much for the deeper portions of the Blade and wish there was more to do outside of the Blade, but whatever, lines have to be drawn. It fleshed out some of the themes that the base game was too locked down to address, and it fulfilled the fantasy of getting into Palisade's weird building that looms over the cityscape. I was ready to call this the best Deus Ex expansion content ever made, until I played A Criminal Past. Perched high above the desolate Arizona desert is a prison for augmented criminals. These prisoners are suppressed by a control chip that prevents them from using their powers. Set months before the events of Mankind Divided, Jensen infiltrates this prison, the Penley T. Housefather Correctional Facility, as a jumpsuited offender with a false name. Jensen is tasked with making contact with another Task Force 29 agent, Guerrero, who has been undercover for a very long time because of information they might have about a future terror attack. A Criminal Past feels like Mankind Divided as a game and Eidos Montreal as a developer finally reaching their rhythm and fulfilling their potential. It's such a fun and engaging prequel to the events of the main game. Like, really fun. It reminded me so much of Murder on Eridanos, Obsidian's last piece of content for the Outer Worlds, with how much they finally figure out the fun in that last piece of content they would ever make for it. The writing here isn't just better, it makes the stuff going on in the main game look boring in comparison. This has some of the best characters and character moments in Eidos Montreal's Deus Ex universe, including this fun little instance where one of the prisoners, D-Town, recognizes Jensen from his time as a cop in Detroit however many years earlier. A Criminal Past kicks off with Jensen being processed into his new prison life. His augs are suppressed in a painful procedure overseen by the camp's security chief, who looks like an old Phil Spencer. Your contact is in the next cell block over, and getting over there isn't the easiest task. You'll meet some interesting characters here who have spent however long establishing their power in this situation and have been scheming for some time, waiting for their moment to spring them into action. In so many ways, this DLC reminds me of Prisoner of War, an OG Xbox game from 2002 in which you had to break out of a series of Nazi prison camps with a real-time day-night cycle and schedule that you had to adhere to. It was tense and interesting, and an extremely unique take on the puzzle adventure game. This DLC is the closest that any game has approached that game's unique blend of setting and mechanics. Did I mention that Penley T. Housefather is a badass fucking name? That is definitely a senator from Arizona. But before you get too comfortable with the illusion of a prison routine, something I was actually interested in, Jensen is already moving on. Once he breaks out of his cell block and meets with Guerrero, the prison chief sweeps in and knocks him out. While you're under, the inmates overthrow the place, causing all kinds of violent, destructive madness as they regain control of their augs. Yeah, you only spend the first quarter of your time here in captivity, before you're using all your skills to uncover a complex scheme involving Guerrero and the prisoners having their augmentations being harvested for profit. Honestly, I would have loved an entire immersive sim, Deus Ex or not, Jensen or not, that builds out this prisoner concept more completely. Oh, it would have been great to explore more of the routine, have lights out, work hard to exchange items and information, build relationships, so on and so forth. Someday, I guess. As a result of the abbreviated timeline leading up to the riot, you don't get to know your fellow prisoners really well. You have to build rapport pretty quick. And yet, similar to how System Rift puts a sharper edge to this universe's anti-aug sentiment, A Criminal Past puts an edge to the backlash that augmented people faced in the wake of the aug incident. Again, how much more interesting would the base game have been if they'd not muzzled these vicious truths? Over the course of this DLC, you wind up exploring nearly every inch of this facility, which features a lot of variety from the prison blocks to the administrative side, all the way up to the helipad you arrive on. There are vents in here, obviously, but there are plenty of back areas that aren't vents too, which makes it feel more naturalistic. Oh, here's this lights out puzzle you need to complete to activate this emergency override. It only took me 2.5 minutes to solve. I haven't even mentioned the narrative frame device. The basis of this DLC is that you're playing the events of the story as Adam is telling it to Delara, giving you opportunities to throw her off. The twist, then, is that Delara is concerned about whether memories in your brain match what the Illuminati installed during that time that Jensen was out of commission in Alaska. The problem with this revelation is that it's buried so deeply in the subtext of the story that I still had to dig out confirmation from multiple sources online. There's no cutaway to Jensen being programmed because, again, those 2 years between games must remain very undescribed and undepicted. I love this DLC. It is absolutely the best Deus Ex related content since the original game. Easily and completely, I freaking love it. I want more. It's interesting and it's fun to play, and I want more of this far more than I want a third Jensen game, which I will absolutely have words about as we wrap this thing up. But first, we have to talk about the stuff that really isn't that great, starting with Breach feels like a mode mandated by Square-Enix to financially justify this expensive 30-hour single-player campaign in a niche subgenre. Within moments of opening up this Tron-styled standalone challenge mode, you feel the onslaught of mechanics and unlocks and microtransaction opportunities. I don't know, maybe this kind of game seems gross to me and not to kids used to playing major free-to-play games that attempt to exploit their parents for cash, like Fortnite or Roblox. At a top level, Breach is a series of challenges to unlock a variety of different currencies, accomplish different objectives, and reach different nodes or servers, moving from level to level. Within each server, Breach is Mankind Divided's gameplay stripped down to down and back circuits, where you complete a number of different objectives before time runs out. You're dodging past virtual cameras with virtual vision cones, you're snapping to cover and blasting virtual enemies with weird polygonal guns, you're hacking stuff. Yeah, it's a Deus Ex simulator, alright. Sometimes these servers feature the branding of whatever corporation owns them, so that's kinda cool. This first-person virtual environment stuff, if you've decided to play through the campaign first, is teed off when you're hacking Task Force 29 server to access Miller's chat logs. It's pretty effective as a tutorial, but honestly, as it layers on the mechanics, it never becomes very fun. Getting into it for this review, I'd forgotten I'd already done a handful of levels, so I had a bit of a leg up, which also meant I missed some light tutorialization that I probably needed to brush up on. Oh well. Playing this is just ugh. It's no surprise to me that people hate this thing. Reading impressions from Redditors in the decades since this release, it's clear that a whole lot of people only play this far enough to unlock the achievement on their way to the PlayStation Platinum for it. There are microtransactions and loot crates. There are lots of different currencies and weapons you can get, and currency to upgrade those weapons. You gain praxis points in here to upgrade your virtual AUGs, as if you're cosplaying as Adam Jensen. The levels are tedious, and it's just so boring. It's complicated for the sake of being complicated, with the goal of obfuscating the boring, unfun gameplay with thick, free-to-play cruft. What's so tragic about Breach is clearly quite a bit of time and effort went into it, and it's just so wrong-headed about everything it tries to do. Even with an awesome art direction, some interesting level aesthetics, and some neat ideas about anthropomorphizing your hacking attempts, as you drive a virtual avatar into a computer server elsewhere on the planet, there's absolutely nothing about this I ever want to play again. Breach dangles no interesting carrots to lure you into play more. It has all the playability and enjoyment of a graphing calculator. The idea that anyone would spend much time with this, much less the idea that Square-Enix thought people would enjoy it so much that they'd hand them buku bucks for playing it, is incredibly sad. After completing the game, you can dive back in with a New Game Plus mode. This allows you to import all of the AUGs you've installed and all the inventory you've acquired from your first playthrough. Arriving in Dubai yet again, this initially made me pretty cocky because I thought I was much stronger and capable than I actually was. In retrospect, this was kind of absurd because the tutorial starts you out with a whole lot of weapons and augmentations anyway. It's not until you're in Prague with your augs reset that you get to truly take advantage of what you've packed in. When I started this review, I'd intended on doing a full second playthrough of the game in the same way I did with Prey 2017, but I quickly realized that this wasn't ideal for two big reasons. First, having all those augs and guns and tools available from the get-go made the game too easy, even at its most difficult setting. This kind of game works because if one particular method of tackling a challenge doesn't work, there's another way around. But what if there are no obstacles? That just inherently makes everything a cakewalk because your first choice is just as good as any other. Why would you ever stealth your way through a scenario if you can successfully carve your way through with ammunition? Secondly, Mankind Divided's story is extremely linear and doesn't offer a lot of variability from run to run. Despite all the content in here, there are very few long-term choices to shape what you do in the main story. Therefore, distinguishing any playthrough really does amount to which side quests you attend to, how much loot you plunder from the world, how many lockers you crack open, and how interested you are in buttoning through all the game's dialogue again. Maybe in a few years this will be less of an issue because I'll forget enough of this game. There's also a weird small glitch when you meet with your AUG doctor early on, where the game decided not to reflect any of the AUGs you brought in when it explains the experimental AUGs. This is absolutely confusing because it temporarily looks like you've lost all the ones you brought in from your first playthrough. They could have done a bit better with that, but no one's ever going to fix it at this point. So, speaking of which, are they ever going to fix this game? Or this series? Deus Ex Mankind Divided is a house divided against itself. It's sleeker than Human Revolution and arguably better designed as a play space, and the shooting mechanics and controls are much improved. But once the initial story hook of finding out who the terrorists were, the story just takes a nosedive, clearly influenced by the rush that Eidos Montreal was under from Square-Enix to cram in the severely unnecessary multiplayer components. It's a tragic tale of trend chasing ruining what could have been a truly special game that spawned a conclusive third entry instead of a flawed gem that we'll always remember for its smart hub design, improved feel, and pretty decent writing and graphics, but never quite for what it ended as, a missed opportunity for greatness. Patreon assistant producer, Midnight Medium.
What the fuck are you doing here, Johnson? Nah. It wasn't Johnson. What the hell was it? Johansson!
There's no need for any trouble, I just want to use the elevator.
You do, huh? Well, ain't that a fucking shame? See, this is my elevator now.
No, it isn't. Look, just let me use it and I'll be on my way.
This is where I shit, asshole! Now get out of here and find your own fucking elevator.
And so we reach the end. Again. Because not only am I reviewing this game again, this is still also the end of the Deus Ex universe as we know it. Before the announcement of Deus Ex Remastered by developer Aspyr as I was writing this script, a game that was facing a dump truck of backlash over its barely upgraded visuals, Mankind Divided was the last entry, the last SKU in the Deus Ex universe. Nearly a decade after Mankind Divided released, and I played it last, I still can't help but compare Eidos Montreal's final work to the original game. I mean, it's in the name, for crying out loud. Since my first review of this game, I've reviewed the original game, which I never had before, as well as Human Revolution, which I also never had before. Through those videos, I began to understand more than ever what made them tick. It also highlighted the shift in gaming culture that forced Eidos Montreal to make a number of changes to the Deus Ex formula for their contemporary audiences. It was also very cool to replay this game and address all the content I didn't get to experience because it wasn't out yet, some of which is the best stuff for this game. Here's the thing. I actually kinda dreaded playing Mankind Divided when it released, and I think that by reviewing it back then, I'd understand why. But you can watch my original review and see that I didn't quite put it together. A lot of my hesitation came from my broadly underwhelming feelings for Eidos Montreal's previous game. Don't get me wrong, Human Revolution was fun. I certainly didn't regret playing it when that game dropped in 2011, but it wasn't really what I was looking for in a modern extension of one of my favorite games. It felt too streamlined, it felt too linear. The story was a drowsy stew of people and events that I really didn't care about. And then there were those boss battles. But even those were things I couldn't quite articulate until I put it under a fine-tooth comb when I finally reviewed it in 2021. And so now I sit with Mankind Divided and reviewing it again properly, I begin to understand why this game didn't quite do it for me either. Between these two games, I can articulate why a third Eidos Montreal Deus Ex game isn't something I'm cheering for. What frustrates me most of all are the myriad of creative decisions that Eidos Montreal made, and plenty that they didn't. Mankind Divided still tries to tell too much story. It feels like a game where they hired the writer's room of a 25-episode-a-year B-grade sci-fi channel series, and their work reflects in the quality of this narrative, and definitely the quantity. There are too many characters, and precious few of them are very interesting when it seemed that everyone who stepped on stage in the original game brought something exciting. There are too many narrative dead ends, plot points that don't matter, a misuse of narrative tension. And then it ends abruptly with a confrontation you can't easily explain or justify. It's clear that they didn't come in with a plan for a second Jensen game, and it shows very completely. What seemed to keep this game's development on track when the writers, directors, and designers seemed lost otherwise is that any sequel to Human Revolution is functionally abridged to the original game. Mankind Divided moves away from the eccentric stylings of their first game, a choice that always seemed 3 or 4 leagues too ambitious, as pretty as it was, with the dream of moving it closer to the worn-down aesthetic of the original game. That made sense of this game's more conservative art direction, but then again, there are millions of people who have played these Eidos Montreal games who didn't play the originals and don't care about this shift at all. It was also nice to see them gradually introduce characters that shape the world of the original game. These inclusions dodge being fan service by being so important to how the future world came to be. Whether intentional or not, there are plenty of narrative loose ends here that only seem to exist as a flimsy excuse to continue Jensen's story into a third game. We still don't really know what became of Dr. Megan Reed after that first game, and we only get a glimpse of her continued existence here, much less her rationales. There are so many organizations spun up in here that clearly didn't get enough attention this time around that could really fill in a third game as well, provided they wouldn't just slather on a whole new batch. And then there's Janus and the Juggernaut Collective, who were only briefly touched upon with a strong hint that we'd see more of them in a third game. David Seraph's storyline also hints at something greater. There's still that unexplained 2-year gap in Jensen's story between the first 2 games, and somehow the Illuminati is involved. Somehow? But it's also very easy to forget that Mankind Divided was designed as a flagship entry of a much bigger push by Square-Enix to make Deus Ex a thing. In the opening logo parade, you see Deus Ex Universe, which was a brand and an app and a couple of other games that were supposed to work together. Hopefully, these would all sell super well so they could justify producing more games, expand the universe, and so on. Within Mankind Divided are rare and hidden triangular code objects in the world. You could scan these with the Deus Ex Universe app on your phone to get more, stuff. This app, unfortunately, is no longer available. Deus Ex Go, a turn-based puzzle game, was briefly unavailable for a time, but you can grab it and enjoy it today. You can even grab and play Breach as a standalone game on Steam without needing to download and install Mankind Divided. But you won't. So then we get to the hard vacuum that's come about in the decade since Mankind Divided, because there hasn't been a third Jensen game to wrap Eidos Montreal's efforts up with a firm, fluffy bow. There's been a lot of text typed and ink spilled about the fabled conclusion of Jensen's arc, and unfortunately, Mankind Divided didn't indicate it had a clear way to wrap it up beyond the Pursue Janus tease. As a former writer at Eidos Montreal explained, they already knew that they couldn't fundamentally change the trajectory of the Illuminati, so there's little that Jensen could have done in the grand scheme of things to shape their efforts. He could have really only contributed to or bounced off of them. Eidos Montreal painted themselves in a corner by not introducing more elements and characters to the Illuminati, except in fleeting glances, that they could own and manage in advance of a predetermined conclusion. Eidos Montreal could have laid out so much more groundwork narratively about the clandestine operations of this ancient group that would have given them prime material to manipulate with these stories. Unfortunately, they had none of the foresight and did none of the legwork here. In fact, not only did they squander the Illuminati in here, they pretty much wasted any opportunity to set them up in Human Revolution by leaving them to fanservice-y bookends that amount to mere seconds of game time. It feels as if they were slow-walking any grand plans they may have had, as if they believed they would have 10 titles to explain the quarter century before the events of the original game. But hey, Human Revolution gave you an entire side quest with Dr. Megan Reed's mom, and another involving Jensen's upbringing in an orphanage. Yay! With how clearly Eidos Montreal bumbled their way with the writing of these two games so far, I've never, ever had much faith in what a third Jensen game would have said or accomplished. I just don't have much faith that any extension of the storyline would amount to much when, seemingly, Jensen was crammed into his own second game to begin with, and a trilogy was never the long-term goal. But let's be real. Would I play through the conclusion of the Jensen arc, whatever it may be? Would I enjoy watching him dissolve in a vat of molten steel, flicking a thumbs up as he descends into his inevitable fate, an unremembered footnote of an unread history book in the original game? Well, I mean, sure. And for 2 years, Eidos Montreal was apparently working on just that, maybe without the molten vat part. Square-Enix never had much faith in their Western studios, the ones they bought from Eidos, so when they had the opportunity to sell those studios, they did. The Embracer Group bought them, along with about half the video game industry at the time, and Embracer still canceled the Deus Ex game they were working on. This has left the future of the franchise in vague territory, or the hands of Aspyr, who are giving us a remaster of the original game by way of the graphical styling of its 2003 sequel, Invisible War. I can take it or leave it. Deus Ex has never been a good-looking game in need of ray tracing or whatever, and I'm glad it's being updated to work on modern machines without additional mods or fan patches. But it's not just the future of the Deus Ex series that's been in doubt, it's the future of the immersive sim as a whole. From Thief to Deus Ex and 2017's Prey to Dishonored, dedicated immersive sims have never had much commercial luster. Boundless locker scrounging, complex interwoven narratives, and the intricacies of the immersive sim became far too nerdy for most people, apparently. What happened instead was that open-world action games began to adapt RPG mechanics, which is basically what MSims are. Ubisoft built a reputation on making more and more of those games. From Far Cry 3 to Watch Dogs to even the latest Star Wars Outlaws, Ubisoft built a mono-genre that blended immersive sim gameplay with hang gliding and driving around. They're all essentially immersive sim mechanics in a more open, action-oriented wrapper. Even CD Projekt Red's Cyberpunk 2077 scratches 90% of that Deus Ex itch while featuring higher quality storytelling, much better graphics, and a much larger, more immersive environment. In retrospect, Mankind Divided is such an interesting experience because it tries to thread its needle through being a more traditionally focused immersive sim while also trying to make the leap to more open world gameplay. The only problem with this is what I described however many hours ago. This isn't an open world game, it's just a big hub, so it lacks many of the elements and mechanics that the open world action genre enjoys. These days, the conventional immersive sim has become adopted by smaller indie teams that aren't focused on lavish production values with high fidelity assets and voiceover like Eidos Montreal was with their games. Nowadays, a successful immersive sim seems to be built around similar financial and logistical restrictions to what the original Deus Ex was created under. It seems to me that if Deus Ex is going to get a new entry, whether it's to cap Jensen's story or not, the best way to do it is to have a couple dozen developers put it together. You don't need ray tracing, you don't need 9-digit budgets. You just need to focus on meaningful interactions and simulations and giving the player a meaningful sense of agency to shape the world to their desires. I know it seems like I've been dogging on Mankind Divided for this whole review, but I'll tell you what, I've learned a lot in the 9 years between these reviews. I kinda dreaded my first playthrough, and when I finished it, I was still confused about what I just experienced. This time around, I understood far more about this game's big wins and where it truly lets the player down, and you know what? I enjoyed it far more. Hello! Welcome back! It's the end of the video, finally. It's finally another video, you could say. I'm sorry, it's been a while. My roadmap for last year, for 2025, became very different. This took way too long to make. But I also have a job right now where I'm doing a lot of video production. So this, at the end of the day, am I coming back to work on more video stuff? Probably not. It's not usually how it goes. So that's really, it's the same thing with the indie a few years back. But unfortunately, it means that in 2025, I only had one video out. I'm going to do a channel update. I'm going to finally do the 2025 year in review. But for this video, I do want to mention that in the time that it took to produce this, they not only announced Deus Ex Remastered, but then they put it on indefinite hold based on community feedback. And I was thinking about changing the conclusion, but it's like, no, I kind of said what I needed to say. I didn't think it was an ugly game. I don't care that much about how it looks. I was more concerned about what they're going to do for the gameplay. I was excited about it finally coming in consoles for the first time, but fanboys will be fanboys. Again, Deus Ex has never been a pretty game, and it had kind of like Invisible War vibes, really, because Invisible War was not a pretty game either, and it was so just dramatically different. And it's like, oh, you can't put that Invisible War, aesthetic on that first game. That's not right. You can't have people looking like moist clay like Prey does, the 2007 game, the id Tech 3 based game. You can't do it. So anyway, I still want to check out that remastered despite the backlash. I just hope it's just not trash. I know Aspyr doesn't have the best track record, but here we are. We're at the end. This is, again, the end of Deus Ex, and maybe they're using remaster as a market case for, hey, there's money left in this rock. Maybe we can, squeeze it and maybe justify more games. And again, I'm not sold on the idea of a third Jensen game. Just let him die. Let someone else take the throne. Maybe tell that bridge story before all those actors die. Cliff Stevens. Don't get another Bob Page performance out of him. And, maybe that's the way. But, just strip it back. You don't need the big, elaborate art direction. You don't need the hugely detailed, dense technology. Just dial it back. Just make it simple, man. Just bring it back. So, hey, I want to thank my producers who have been supporting me this entire time. James Wyatt, John M., Christina Adams, Lee Kenyon, Mitchell, Romega, and Steven Brunwasser. I don't know why I didn't, almost fumbled through that. So, as I'm going to be working on some small projects on the channel. We're looking at Routine in the near future as a collab thingy. And, yeah, I'm hesitant with all the stuff I've got going on locally that's pulling my attention away in a good way, this is a good thing. I'm in a position where, I'm doing work that is really resonant, whereas this game review stuff seems to have not, and I'm glad you guys enjoyed it. It just, I can't contribute as much time to it as I once dreamt, and that's, it sucks and it's okay at the same time. It's okay to be dialectical. It's okay for two things to be opposite but the same at the same time. So, appreciate you guys. Stay tuned. We're always in Discord. Check it out. And, I'll see you next time, okay?